Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The scratching always starts at 3:17 a.m. Not the gentle patting of house settling or the scurrying of mice behind drywall, but deliberate, methodical scraping of something razor-sharp against wood. 3 parallel lines, then 4, then 5, always one more than the number of unread emails sitting in my inbox. I discovered the pattern 6 weeks ago. I wish I hadn't. My therapist called it digital hygiene, this compulsion to clear my inbox before sleep. A harmless quirk, she said, even beneficial in our always connected lives. A ritual that gives you control, she explained with that practiced smile. She never asked what happened when I failed. How could I tell her that my house seemed to notice? To punish? It started with small anomalies. Night shifts at the tech firm left me exhausted, inbox bloated with client demands, colleague requests, and automated reminders. The first time I collapsed without addressing them all, I dreamt of fingernails against chalkboard, woke drenched in sweat, dismissed it as stress until I noticed the marks on my attic door the next morning. 3 perfect lines, as if carved by something meticulous and patient. I told myself it was coincidence. Houses creak and settle, wood splits in unpredictable ways. But the following night, when I cleared every message, replied to every thread, and achieved that precious 0 unread, the scratches were gone. The wood looked pristine, impossibly smooth. Not weathered oak from the 1930s, but something unblemished, like freshly printed veneer. Wrong. Too perfect. For weeks I maintained discipline, regardless of how late I worked, how many drinks I'd had at office functions, or how my eyelids drooped over flickering screens. I cleared that inbox. No scratches appeared. My sleep improved. I convinced myself I'd imagined the connection. Until the Wilson Project deadline. 3 consecutive all-nighters left 17 messages unanswered. Too exhausted to care, I shut my laptop and collapsed into bed without my ritual. The scratching woke me, not from the attic door this time, but inside the attic itself. Fingernails against keyboard keys, rapid rhythmic tapping punctuated by mechanical chimes of message sent. My mouth went desert dry. Sweat beaded instantly along my hairline despite the October chill. My rational mind assembled explanations: a rodent infestation, loose shingles in the wind, pipes contracting. But my body knew better, pulse hammering in my throat, muscles coiled to run. I forced myself toward the narrow staircase tucked behind my bedroom closet. Each step groaned underfoot, announcing my approach to whatever waited above. The sound of typing grew louder, more frantic. The unmistakable whoosh of outgoing mail repeated, again and again. The door to the attic, the one that had borne those impossible scratches, hung slightly ajar. Pale blue light spilled through the crack, illuminating dust particles suspended in the air like static. No rodent makes that light. No wind mimics the exact tonal signature of keyboard strokes. My hand trembled violently as I pushed the door open. The hinges whined, a sound too much like pleading. In the center of my otherwise empty attic sat an ancient IBM ThinkPad, screen glowing with toxic intensity. The laptop I'd owned in college, the one I'd discarded after a coffee spill fried the motherboard over a decade ago. It sat unplugged, no power cord in sight, lid fully open, keys depressing in rapid succession without human fingers to guide them. My inbox displayed on screen, not the sleek modern interface of today, but the primitive client from 2006. Yet somehow it showed my current emails, my current contacts. As I watched, frozen in the doorway, it composed and sent responses to messages I had ignored. The tone, phrasing, and signature were flawless replications of my writing style, complete with the subtle sarcasm I use with close colleagues and the formal distance I maintain with management. I stumbled backward, catching myself against the doorframe. The laptop didn't pause its mechanical clacking, didn't acknowledge my presence. My phone buzzed in my pocket. notifications of the emails being answered upstairs by something that wrote exactly like me. Gathering what little courage remained, I approached the machine. The keys continued their phantom dance beneath invisible fingers. I reached out, fighting against every instinct screaming for retreat, and slammed the laptop closed. Silence crashed down, sudden and absolute. For 3 heartbeats, I thought it was over. Then hot, acidic breath rushed against my neck. Not the imagined sensation of paranoia, but wet, chemical-sharp exhalation raising goosebumps across my skin. I whirled around to face empty air, but the damage was done. The scratching resumed, no longer on the door, but on the walls, ceiling, floor, everywhere at once. Wood curled away in thin ribbons as invisible claws carved inward. My name appeared in the warped paneling, letters forming in deep relief like something pushing through from another dimension. Not scratched on the surface, but emerging from within the wood itself. My legs gave way. I collapsed onto dust-covered floorboards, phone clutched in my shaking hand. A notification illuminated the screen. 1 new email. Subject line empty. Sender, my own address. The message contained 2 sentences. Process pending on upper floor. Resume session immediately. I ran, slammed the attic door, fled downstairs, and drove to an all-night diner where I sat trembling under fluorescent lights until dawn. Used my phone to answer every unanswered message, cleared every notification, emptied every folder. Only then did I dare return home. The attic door stood unmarked, wood grain normal and unremarkable. When I finally gathered courage to check upstairs, the room was empty. No laptop, no carved name, no evidence anything had occurred. For 2 weeks, I maintained perfect digital discipline. No email waited more than minutes for response. Co-workers remarked on my improved communication. My supervisor mentioned promotion possibilities. The house remained silent at night. Then came the international client crisis. Midnight conference calls with Tokyo, emergency strategy sessions, hundreds of messages flooding in faster than I could address them. By 2 a.m., with 37 emails unanswered, I faced a choice: continue working until dawn, or risk whatever waited upstairs. I chose sleep, silencing notifications and burying my head under pillows. 3:17 a.m. The scratching returned, but different now. Not frantic or threatening, but methodical, almost professional. My phone lit up with notifications, emails answering themselves, messages I hadn't composed resolving threads, my digital life proceeding without my input. In the morning, I checked my sent folder. Perfect responses to every message. Better than I would have written, more diplomatic, more thorough. My boss called to congratulate me on salvaging the Tokyo situation overnight. Now I understand the arrangement. I let the process run when deadlines overwhelm me. I pretend not to hear the typing from upstairs. Ignore the occasional whiff of battery acid breath in hallways. My career advances. My inbox remains at 0. But the process is changing. Last week I found scratches inside my refrigerator, my cabinets, my shower tiles. Yesterday, I discovered my laptop answering emails I hadn't yet received, responding to questions no one had asked. Sometimes I wake to find myself already at my desk, fingers moving across keys without conscious direction. My reflection in the monitor shows eyes too wide, smile too fixed. The scratching sounds now come from beneath my fingernails, not the attic door. I've started receiving emails from myself with meeting invitations. Subject line, performance review. Location, upper floor. Time, always scheduled for 3:17 a.m. I've declined each invitation so far, but with each refusal, I find more scratches. Inside my medicine cabinet, under my sheets, along the inside of my throat when I swallow. Tonight, I have 38 messages requiring attention. It would take hours to address them properly. My cursor hovers over the power button. Sleep beckons. Upstairs, something is already typing. Story 2. The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was the building settling. Old apartments make noise. Everyone knows that. But buildings don't open books to specific pages. They don't underline passages in perfect straight lines that weren't there when you went to sleep. And they certainly don't leave the scent of fresh sawdust behind. I remember standing in my office that first morning, heart hammering against my ribs as I stared at the open book on my desk. My copy of Creative Problem Solving and Engineering lay splayed open to page 127, a passage about recursive algorithms highlighted with precision no human hand could manage. The previous night, that book had been shelved, spine firmly against the wall. I was certain of it. The clock on my wall read 7:15 a.m. I had woken at exactly 3:23, 1 minute after the phenomenon began, though I wouldn't understand the significance of that time until later. A sound had pulled me from sleep, a soft thump followed by the whisper of pages turning. By the time I'd gathered enough courage to investigate, whatever had happened was complete. That first morning, I almost called in sick. My hands trembled as I picked up the book, my fingertips brushing against the highlighted text. A peculiar electrical tingle shot up my arm. The solution to the coding problem that had stalled my project for weeks suddenly crystallized in my mind with perfect clarity. It wasn't just a solution. It was elegant, innovative, the kind of insight that gets people promoted. I should have been disturbed. Instead, I was intrigued. 3 weeks later, I had received my first promotion in 5 years. The mysterious book incidents continued with clockwork regularity, always at 3:22 a.m., always providing the exact insight I needed for whatever project deadline loomed. Sometimes it was my textbooks, other times reference manuals or obscure academic journals I'd purchased but never read. Each morning, a new solution, a new path forward. The first true warning came when I noticed the marginalia. Faint at first, nearly imperceptible marks in the margins beside the highlighted passages. They appeared to be calculations, written in a spidery hand using ink so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When I ran my fingers over the marks, they came away with the unmistakable scent of fresh sawdust. No matter how much I washed my hands afterward, the smell lingered for hours. I mentioned the strange occurrences to my therapist during our monthly session. Dr. Matthews adjusted her glasses and suggested I might be sleepwalking, perhaps manifesting solutions to work problems through subconscious activity. I nearly believed her until she asked about my family history of mental illness. Something in her clinical tone made me stop. I lied, telling her I'd set up cameras and discovered I was indeed sleepwalking. She seemed relieved. I never brought it up again. The notes in the margins grew more extensive over time. Calculations gave way to comments, comments to criticisms, criticisms to warnings. The handwriting remained the same. Tight, precise loops that looked almost like musical notation in places. I began to understand they were instructions rather than mere observations, instructions I was following without fully comprehending. One night in early October, I deliberately shelved all my books with their spines facing inward. I locked my office door and placed a line of salt across the threshold, a superstitious gesture that embarrassed me even as I completed it. At 3:22 a.m., I was jolted awake by a sound like wooden mallets striking in unison. The books, their spines. I lay paralyzed in bed, a cold sweat breaking across my forehead as the rhythmic thumping continued. Thump, 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 like a heartbeat, like my heartbeat, which accelerated to match the tempo. My chest tightened as though iron bands were constricting around my ribs. Then came the laughter, high, childlike but not childish. A sound of pure, cruel delight that seemed to emanate from within my own chest cavity, rather than from the office beyond my bedroom wall. By morning, my sheets were soaked with sweat. In my office, 3 books lay open on my desk, their pages marked more aggressively than ever before. The marginalia now contained a single repeated phrase, "Payment comes due." I should have stopped then. I should have burned the books, moved apartments, perhaps even cities. Instead, I took the solution offered in those open pages, completed my project 2 weeks ahead of schedule, and accepted my second promotion with a handshake and a smile that stretched my face to breaking point. Sleep became elusive after that night. I would lie awake until 3:21 a.m., then squeeze my eyes shut as the second hand ticked forward. Sometimes nothing happened. On those mornings, no books would be open, no solutions presented. I began to fear these silent nights more than the active ones. At least the open books brought progress, advancement, success. The smell of sawdust grew stronger in my apartment. It clung to my clothes, my hair, my skin. Colleagues commented on it, their noses wrinkling slightly as they moved away from me in meetings. My boss praised my innovative thinking while maintaining an extra foot of distance between us. I bought stronger soap, industrial cleansers, scented candles. Nothing helped. Last week I received the largest project of my career, developing a revolutionary algorithm that could predict market fluctuations with unprecedented accuracy. The deadline, impossible. The reward for success, considerable. The consequence of failure, unspoken, but clearly catastrophic. For 6 nights, the books remained closed. No thumping, no laughter, no solutions. My anxiety spiraled as the deadline approached with cruel inevitability. I couldn't eat, couldn't concentrate. The smell of sawdust intensified until it felt like my lungs were filling with fine wooden particles every time I inhaled. Then yesterday, I came home to find a book I'd never seen before resting on my desk. Its leather binding was unmarked, its pages thick and cream-colored. No title, no author, no publisher information. My hand shook as I reached for it, fingers hovering inches away from its surface as a wave of cold dread washed over me. Something told me opening this book would change everything, that whatever arrangement I had unknowingly entered was approaching its conclusion. I poured myself 3 fingers of whiskey and drank it in one burning swallow before I found the courage to lift the cover. Inside was no text, no helpful highlighted passage, only a mirror, its surface cloudy and dull. My reflection stared back at me, but not as I was. As I watched, horror crawling up my spine like a column of ice, my face began to age. Wrinkles carved themselves around my eyes, creased my forehead. My hair thinned, grayed, and receded. My shoulders hunched, skin sagged, eyes clouded. Decades passed in seconds as my reflection withered before me. A droplet of sweat fell from my brow onto the mirror's surface, and the glass, if it was glass, absorbed it like a sponge takes in water. My breath caught in my throat as the mirror darkened, becoming as black and light-absorbing as the ink in the margins. Instinctively, I reached for my phone, activated the flashlight, and shined it onto the page. The light didn't reflect. It vanished into the blackness. Then, impossibly, it projected upward onto my ceiling. Words formed, glowing and unsteady as though written in fire. Every inspiration charges interest. Deadline ends at dawn. My heart threatened to burst from my chest. I slammed the book shut and backed away, my calves hitting the edge of my bed. The leather cover began to pulse like something alive, like a heart beating beneath stretched skin. The familiar smell of sawdust intensified until I gagged, doubling over as my stomach heaved. When I straightened, the book was open again, though I hadn't touched it. The mirror was gone. In its place was a contract, written in that same spidery handwriting that had filled the margins of my books. At the bottom was a signature, my signature, though I had no memory of signing anything. The terms were simple and horrifying. Every solution I'd been given was actually a loan. Every promotion, every accolade, every success had been borrowed. And as with all loans, payment was required. The price, time. My time. Years of my life, collected in advance through the mirror, held in escrow until the final deadline. I could repay by completing the impossible project by dawn, creating something truly original, not borrowed or stolen from whatever entity had been helping me, or forfeit the remaining years of my natural life, compressed into a single moment of agony. The laughter started then, emanating from everywhere and nowhere. Not childlike now, but ancient and knowing. It vibrated through my chest cavity, making my ribs ache and my teeth chatter. The books on my shelves began to thump their spines in unison. Thump, thump, thump. A heartbeat countdown to dawn. I've been working through the night, fueled by terror and black coffee. My computer screen glows in the darkness as I type line after line of code, attempting to create something. anything that might satisfy the debt. The project is beyond my capabilities. I know this now. Those inspired solutions were never mine to begin with. Without help, I am mediocre, average, unremarkable. The sky outside my window is beginning to lighten. Pale gray replaces pitch black as dawn approaches with merciless certainty. My fingers are cramping, eyes burning from strain and lack of sleep. The smell of sawdust has become so overwhelming that I taste wood with every breath. The books have gone silent, waiting. As I write these words, a confession, a warning, I can feel time gathering around me like a noose slowly tightening. The mirror book sits open beside my keyboard, its pages now filled with calculations showing exactly how many years I've borrowed. 17 years, 4 months, 12 days, and 9 hours, plus interest. I understand now what I didn't before. Success always comes at a cost. Inspiration isn't free, and some deadlines once missed can never be extended. The first ray of sunlight has just broken over the horizon. I have only moments left to create something truly mine. Story 3. The cold fluorescent light of elevator P6 flickers intermittently, casting momentary shadows across my face in the mirror. Something isn't right. In the fractured milliseconds between the light's death and rebirth, I catch glimpses of a version of myself that lingers just behind my movements, a half-second delay that shouldn't exist in a reflection. I've been taking this elevator for 5 years, but only now do I notice this anomaly. Perhaps it was always there, quietly waiting for me to see. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm a financial analyst at Meridian Tower, a gleaming 50-story monument to corporate excess in downtown Chicago. What I'm about to share defies logical explanation, yet I record these events with clinical precision, partly to maintain my increasingly tenuous grip on reality, and partly because I fear no one will believe me otherwise. 3 weeks ago, I arrived early to prepare for the quarterly earnings presentation. At 4:37 a.m., the underground parking garage was a concrete tomb of silence. Level P6, the deepest level, offered only the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional drip of condensation from pipes overhead. I parked in my usual spot and made my way to the elevator, my footsteps echoing against bare walls. The elevator doors slid open with a muted chime. Inside, the harsh lighting had always made me look sickly in the mirrored walls, accentuating the dark crescents beneath my eyes and the pallor of too many late nights. I adjusted my tie and pressed the button for the 37th floor. As the doors closed, sealing me inside the ascending box, I noticed something peculiar. My movements in the mirror lagged by the slightest margin, perhaps half a second. I raised my hand. The reflection followed after a barely perceptible delay. I dismissed it as sleep deprivation, an optical illusion born from too many 18-hour workdays and not enough rest. Then I saw it. My reflection raised its right index finger to the mirror's surface, tracing letters in the non-existent condensation. But my actual finger remained at my side. A cold weight settled in my stomach as I watched phantom letters appear on the glass. D-E-S-C-E. My reflection completed the message. Go down. My throat constricted. I blinked hard, convinced I was hallucinating. When I opened my eyes, the message had vanished. The elevator continued its ascent, passing P3, P2, P1, the lobby, and climbing higher. I was about to dismiss the incident entirely when the walls began to vibrate, not the gentle tremor of normal operation, but violent shudders that made the lighting flicker wildly. The sound of metal cables straining filled the small space, the unmistakable noise of something about to snap. I lunged for the emergency button, but before I could reach it, the vibration stopped. The elevator resumed its smooth climb as if nothing had happened. Floor 22, 23, 24. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was perfectly synchronized again. Later that morning, I made inquiries about the elevator's maintenance schedule. The building manager assured me that all systems had been thoroughly checked the previous week, with no issues found. When I described the vibrations, he suggested it might have been a power surge. His casual dismissal almost convinced me to forget the incident. Almost. The next day, I took the stairs to the 37th floor. My colleagues commented on my sweaty appearance, asking if I was feeling unwell. I muttered something about getting more exercise, ignoring their concerned glances. I managed to avoid the elevator for 3 days before a mandatory meeting on the 48th floor forced my hand. Standing in the elevator lobby, watching the illuminated numbers count down, I felt sweat beating on my forehead. When the doors opened, I stepped inside with 4 other people, positioning myself in the corner furthest from the mirrored wall. Still, I couldn't help glancing at my reflection. It adjusted its tie while my hands remained still. No one else noticed. They stared at their phones or watched the floor numbers change, oblivious to the impossible occurrence in their midst. My reflection's eyes met mine, and its lips curled into the slightest smile, sardonic, almost mocking. When the doors opened at the 48th floor, I nearly knocked people over in my haste to exit. After that, the incidents escalated. Each time I was forced to take the elevator, my reflection would act independently in subtle ways. It would check its watch when I wasn't wearing one. It would straighten its collar when mine was already straight. Once, it winked at me while I was mid-conversation with a colleague. I started documenting these occurrences in a journal, noting the date, time, and specific action. Looking at the entries, I could see a pattern forming. The reflections were becoming more assertive, more deliberate in their attempts to communicate. In one particularly disturbing incident, my reflection pointed urgently to the ceiling of the elevator while mouthing words I couldn't comprehend. I consulted a neurologist, describing symptoms of migraine and visual disturbances without mentioning the true nature of my concern. The brain scan showed nothing abnormal. The doctor suggested stress as the likely culprit and recommended therapy and reduced work hours. My supervisor was surprisingly understanding when I requested a temporary reduction in responsibilities. Perhaps my deteriorating appearance, the pronounced eye bags, the constant tremor in my hands, the weight loss, made the request seem reasonable. I didn't tell him that I spent hours researching elevator accidents in the building, or that I had begun exploring fringe online forums dedicated to supernatural phenomena and mirrors. One night, working late, I found myself alone in the office. The blue glow of my computer screen illuminated stacks of financial reports as I attempted to focus on work, rather than my growing obsession. The clock read 11:43 p.m. when I finally admitted defeat and packed my briefcase. As I walked toward the stairwell, a sudden power outage plunged the floor into darkness. Emergency lights activated, casting an eerie red glow through the office. A recorded voice announced that the building's backup generators would restore power shortly, and that all elevators were temporarily inoperable. I stood in the stairwell doorway, calculating whether I could manage 37 flights of stairs in my exhausted state. Before I could decide, the lights flickered back on. The elevators chimed in unison, signaling their return to service. Too tired to contemplate the stairs, I reluctantly approached elevator P6, my usual one. The doors opened invitingly. Inside, I kept my eyes fixed on the control panel, refusing to acknowledge the mirror. The descent began smoothly. Floor 36, 35, 34. Despite my determination, my eyes betrayed me, drawn inexorably to my reflection. What I saw caused my heart to stutter. My reflection stood with its back to me, facing the depths of the mirror as if it were a window to somewhere else. As I watched, frozen in horror, it slowly turned its head. Just its head, 180 degrees to stare back at me with eyes that seemed deeper and darker than my own. Its mouth moved, forming words. "You should have listened." The elevator jerked violently, throwing me against the wall. The lights flickered, and in the momentary darkness, I felt a cold breath against my neck. When the lights returned, my reflection was facing forward again, but now it stood with its hand on the emergency stop handle. I lunged forward, shouting, "No!" The word echoed in the confined space as my reflection pulled the handle. But instead of the elevator stopping, something impossible happened. The mirror itself seemed to open inward like a door, revealing a yawning darkness beyond. My reflection gave me one last sardonic smile before leaping backward into the void. The elevator shuddered to a halt between floors. After several seconds of absolute stillness, the doors opened normally onto the lobby. I stumbled out, aware of a security guard's questioning look. It wasn't until I reached my car that I realized my tie was missing. My hand flew to my throat, feeling the top button of my shirt still fastened, but the tie completely gone. The next day I called in sick. I spent hours pacing my apartment, alternating between convinced that I was having a psychotic break and terrified that something truly supernatural was occurring. Late in the afternoon, I received a call from building security. During routine maintenance of elevator P6, they had found a tie, my tie, caught in the mechanism behind the control panel. They wanted me to confirm it was mine and explain how it got there. I went to the building, where the head of maintenance showed me the tie, frayed and oil-stained. He explained that they had to dismantle part of the elevator to retrieve it. According to him, it was physically impossible for the tie to have entered the machinery from the cabin. Yet there it was. While they focused on the tie, I stared at the mirror in the elevator. My reflection stared back, perfectly synchronized for the first time in weeks. But something was different. The eyes that looked back at me seemed emptier, the posture slightly off. I raised my hand to my face. The reflection did the same with perfect timing. But as I lowered my hand, I noticed the reflection's pinky finger twitched slightly after mine had stopped moving. That night, I researched the building's history. Meridian Tower was constructed 15 years ago, but the land it stood on had previously been occupied by a psychiatric hospital that closed in the 1970s after allegations of patient mistreatment. One account particularly caught my attention. A patient who claimed his reflection was trying to switch places with him. I've been sleeping poorly, haunted by dreams of falling endlessly through darkness. Sometimes I wake believing I'm on the other side of a mirror, looking out at a world that's almost but not quite my own. Everything is reversed, slightly delayed, as if I'm the reflection now. This morning I noticed a small scratch on my cheek that I don't remember getting. In the bathroom mirror, I watched as my reflection raised its hand to touch the same spot on its face before I had moved. The scratch seemed deeper in the reflection, almost like a deliberate mark. I've started covering the mirrors in my apartment. At work, I use the stairs exclusively now, no matter how many floors I need to climb. My colleagues have begun to avoid me, exchanging worried glances when they think I'm not looking. My supervisor suggested I take an extended leave of absence. I agreed, but I have no intention of staying away from the building. Tomorrow I'm going back to elevator P6. This time, I'll press the button for the lowest level, P6, where all of this began. I need to understand what my reflection was trying to tell me, why it wanted me to go down instead of up. What waits for me in the depths of the parking garage, I cannot say. But I suspect that whatever entity has been watching me through the mirror will be there, wearing my face, adjusting its tie with half-second precision. I leave this account as testimony. If you ever find yourself in Meridian Tower's elevator P6 and notice your reflection moving just out of sync, don't ignore the warning. Go down when it tells you to. Some doors aren't meant to be opened, and some reflections aren't meant to act on their own. I fear I've released something that should have remained trapped on the other side of the glass. Something that now walks among us wearing a familiar face, while the true owner watches helplessly from behind countless mirrored surfaces, pounding silently for release. And if you see me in the elevator, adjusting my tie with a sardonic smile, run, because it won't be me anymore. I'll be the one half a second behind, trapped in the reflection, trying desperately to warn you about what comes through when the mirror breaks. Story 4. I still remember the moment the first cold shiver traveled down my spine. It was a Friday afternoon, the office lights casting a sterile glow across the sea of identical cubicles. Outside, a gray sky pressed down on the city. My heart pounded because I knew what time it was, 4:40 p.m. That was when everything always shifted, like clockwork. And it all began with a relic I had carelessly picked up at a nautical fair, an unassuming brass compass that had inscribed itself into my life with an uncanny sense of possession. I am not a superstitious person by nature. I used to laugh off ghost stories and regard talk of cursed objects as mere entertainment. But no amount of rational thought could dispel the creeping horror that invaded my every moment once I brought that compass into my office. I had found it weeks ago at a rickety stand in a local maritime market. The seller claimed it belonged to a 19th century admiral, an artifact imbued with centuries of seafaring wisdom. But none of that flamboyant sales pitch compared to the real effect it had when I set it on my desk for the first time. It was a small, heavy piece of brass with a tarnished finish, covered in faint etchings and swirl patterns along its edges. Despite its age, the glass protecting the needle was surprisingly clear, and I could see the pointer trembling there, as if agitated. The moment I placed it next to my keyboard, I realized something was amiss. That slender steel needle shifted and stopped, unwavering, aimed straight at my chest. At first, I merely tilted my head, thinking it might be detecting some magnetic field from my phone. When I attempted to rotate it manually, the compass heated up in my hand until I felt an alarming burn, forcing me to let go. There was a brittle crack from within the brass casing, as though the metal had reached a breaking point. It cooled down moments later, but the sense of dread it left behind would not. From that day forward, I couldn't shake the weird impression that I was being watched. Not just from behind or above, but from every angle possible. It was as though the compass's unwavering pointer had become an invisible eye pinned to my chest. I started checking it with growing anxiety. Each time it pointed at me, never veering more than a fraction of an inch. The strangest occurrences happened on Fridays at 4:40 p.m. sharp. The needle would spin in a frenzy, scraping against the glass as if possessed. Then it would halt, aimed at whichever emergency exit was closest. It didn't matter if I was on the second floor or the 16th. The compass always identified the correct door. That was also the exact instant I'd get an email from an unnamed sender, containing word-for-word transcripts of highly confidential conversations that had happened at my company earlier in the week. I remember telling a colleague, using careful, guarded phrases, that it felt like someone in the building was pranking me. The colleague shrugged, expression tense, hinting that maybe it was just a hacker or a disgruntled ex-employee. But my co-worker's gaze kept darting uneasily at the compass on my desk. Nobody wanted to talk about it openly. Through overheard fragments, I gathered that rumors were spreading about me. Talk of dark energies and ill omens. I pretended not to hear, but deep down, I felt every stare on the back of my neck. One Friday, that fateful 4:40 p.m., arrived again. My heart raced, my pulse thudding in my ears, anticipating the inevitable mania of the spinning needle. Sure enough, it went berserk. The metal scraped the glass with a high-pitched shriek, then aligned itself with the bright red sign marking the emergency staircase. Almost immediately, my inbox pinged. An anonymous email with the subject line simply reading, "Transcript." Inside, I read something that made my stomach turn to ice. It was the exact record of a private management meeting I had attended, with every word I had spoken laid out in an unnerving level of detail. There was no signature, no indication of the sender, just the text, and a single line at the end. "Go now. Follow it." I didn't know what to do. The overhead lights buzzed, and my hands trembled so badly that my mouse nearly slipped from my grip. A nerve in my forehead pulsed as adrenaline flooded my system. My suit felt too tight, my tie threatening to strangle me. I finally stood up, drawn by some compulsion I couldn't resist, and walked toward the exit door. The hallway was eerily silent. Even the distant hum of the air conditioning felt muted. My breathing shallowed as I pushed open the heavy steel door and found myself in the deserted corridor by the emergency stairs. The moment I stepped past the threshold, the compass in my pocket vibrated like a phone on silent mode. An unsettling warmth spread from it, and I could smell something metallic and salty in the air. Then a flicker of light danced in front of me, as if a projector were beaming some archaic film onto the wall. But what I saw was no ordinary image. A churning sea, dark blue waves capped with white foam, roiled in the cramped office corridor. The wind that accompanied it felt shockingly real, blowing against my face with a salty gust that made my eyes water. I stumbled back in disbelief, hearing the faint roar of a storm, though I knew I was still indoors. Papers that had been pinned to bulletin boards came loose, swirling around me before falling in a sodden mess at my feet. Each page bore a rubber stamp in block letters that read, "Imminent insubordination." My heart hammered. My limbs shook so violently that I almost dropped the compass as I pulled it from my pocket. It felt scalding to the touch, yet I couldn't release it. Drawn by some bizarre magnetism, the roiling sea in the hologram grew more tumultuous, and the corridor lights flickered in sync with each crashing wave. I fought to keep my composure, feeling my pulse throb in my temple. A swirling panic rose inside me, and I broke into a cold sweat. Then, as quickly as it had come, the vision winked out. The hallway returned to its mundane fluorescent glare, littered with scattered documents. I realized I was gripping the compass so tightly that my knuckles were white. I nearly sprinted back to my desk, my breath ragged, heart pounding so loudly I was sure everyone in the office must hear it. But few people were around at that time on a Friday. Those who remained in their cubicles or offices, faces turned intently toward their screens. I didn't speak a word to anyone. I grabbed my coat and left, feeling the compass's hot weight in my pocket like a branding iron. That night, I slept with the curtains drawn and the lights on. My body jerked awake multiple times, sweat-soaked, haunted by visions of wave-splashed corridors and cryptic stamps on official documents. Over and over, I felt the breath of some invisible presence lingering just out of sight. The following week was a slow descent into paranoia. I kept sensing my phone vibrating with new anonymous messages, but when I checked, there were none. My coworkers avoided me, voices lowered to hushed tones when I passed. One day, the head of my department asked me how I was doing, though not with any real compassion, more like professional curiosity. I replied that I was just fine, that I had some personal matters to attend to. I tried to sound calm. Inside, my stomach twisted in knots, and I could feel sweat beading on my upper lip. I refused to take out the compass that day, fearing what my manager might see if it started glowing or spinning again. Instead, I kept it locked in my drawer, but I could still sense it, like an insect scratching to get out. On Thursday, I had a moment of fleeting courage. I resolved to get rid of it. I finished my tasks early and took the compass to the furnace room in the basement, a rarely used space under the parking garage. The air there was thick with dust and the smell of damp concrete. My heart pounded as I set the compass on the floor. I looked around for something heavy, a chunk of scrap metal or a hammer. I wanted to smash the device, to end whatever twisted bond it had with me. I found a rusted piece of pipe, lifted it over my head, and prepared to bring it crashing down on that tiny brass sphere. It was like I lost control of my own body. The second I held the pipe high, I felt an excruciating heat radiate from the compass. The pipe turned scorching hot in my hands, forcing me to drop it with a loud clang that echoed around the chamber. My eyes watered from the pain, and I gasped for breath, my lungs constricting as though an unseen current had rushed in and stolen my oxygen. The compass, unharmed and shimmering in the low light, looked almost mocking, as if it knew I couldn't destroy it. In the pit of my stomach, a sense of doom sank in. My knees shook so violently I had to brace myself against a nearby wall. I scooped up the damn thing and stumbled out of the basement, hearing my own ragged breaths in the stairwell. That night I told myself it was all in my head, a stress reaction from too many late hours at the office. But in the mirror, I saw dark circles under my eyes, and my hands wouldn't stop trembling. When I finally collapsed into bed, I dreamed of that roiling sea again, only this time, the horizon was ablaze with a sickly orange glow. As the waves crashed, I saw silhouettes of tall ships, their sails ragged, crossing the corridor like apparitions. I woke up to the sound of my own frantic breathing and realized dawn was still hours away. Friday came again, and the hours leading up to 4:40 p.m. were pure torture. My body buzzed with nervous energy, and each tick of the clock made my chest feel tighter. I found myself glancing at my inbox repeatedly, anticipating the anonymous email that always arrived. My colleagues were cautious around me, as though I were radioactive. The only solace was the coffee machine's repetitive hum, which I used like a mantra to stay grounded. But the more I tried to calm myself, the more insidious the dread became. At exactly 4:39 p.m., my phone pinged. My heart jumped into my throat. I checked my inbox. A single blank message with no subject and no sender, just a timestamp that read 4:40 p.m. It was as though the message had arrived seconds early, a final warning. A cold sweat broke out along my neck. My pulse throbbed. I let out a shaky breath and stared at the clock. The second hand inched forward until it hit 4:40. The compass roared to life within my pocket, vibrating with impossible intensity. I yanked it out, ignoring the blistering heat. The needle spun so fast it blurred, then snapped to a stop, aimed directly at the main lobby doors leading outside. I could hear a ringing in my ears, and my vision blurred at the edges. Another ping from my computer. I forced myself to look at the new email. They know. That was all it said. My stomach knotted so hard I nearly doubled over. I rushed out of my cubicle, and the fluorescent lights dimmed momentarily, as if the building had experienced a power surge. The air tasted stale and metallic on my tongue. My breathing came in shallow gasps, and I found myself half jogging toward the lobby, the weight of the compass dragging my arm downward. In the corridor leading to the main doors, I felt a gust of wind again. My tie whipped against my shoulder, and I smelled that haunting mix of salt and rain. I glanced at the walls and saw flickers of an endless ocean on the polished floor tiles. The overhead lights buzzed and flickered, revealing watery reflections that made the hallway appear submerged. My steps faltered, and each footfall echoed like a drip in some giant cavern. Something brushed past me, intangible yet forceful enough to make me stagger. I pressed on, heart pounding as if it might burst. The large glass doors loomed ahead, but right before I reached them, my boss emerged from the left corridor, her expression severe and her eyes fixed on me. She asked if I was leaving early, though it came out more as a command than a question. Her voice had a sharp edge, but all I could perceive was the relentless beating of my heart. I mumbled something incoherent, a half-formed excuse about not feeling well, never daring to mention the hallucinations or the compass. Her posture suggested suspicion. She mentioned she'd heard strange rumors and was concerned about my recent behavior. I nodded, forced a polite smile, and inched closer to the exit, gripping the compass in my clammy hand. My skin tingled, expecting another wave of supernatural imagery at any second. There was a tension in the air, like waiting for a thunderclap. At my boss's question about whether I was behind some bizarre leaks, I responded in a wavering voice that I didn't know anything about them. She said I should consider taking some time off. I nodded once more, offering no resistance. My breathing was shallow and my mind felt like it was balancing on the edge of an abyss. Without further challenge, she stepped aside, and I escaped through the glass doors onto the street. Outside, traffic roared by, neon signs flickered in the twilight, and horns blared, an urban cacophony that felt oddly grounding after the suffocating hush of the office halls. I walked fast, weaving through the crowd on the sidewalk, the compass still pointing at my chest, as if shackled to my heartbeat. With every step, the sense of being followed intensified. My legs felt rubbery, and sweat trickled down my back. Though the city lights glared overhead, I sensed something lurking in the reflection of every window I passed, just out of sight. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and sagged against it, pulse still racing. The normalcy of my living room did nothing to soothe me. The color drained from my face as I realized I still clutched the compass. The pointer was steady, unwavering, aimed at my chest. I refused to set it down. It felt like setting it aside would open some door I couldn't close again. That night, I stayed awake, reading the transcripts I'd printed, every anonymous email, every conversation I'd received. They seemed to chronicle a growing divide at my workplace, with references to mutiny and insubordination, as though the entire staff were caught in a storm that mirrored the illusions I had witnessed. My name came up repeatedly, woven into rumors of exposing corporate misconduct or leading a rebellion. None of it made sense, yet it all felt chillingly believable. At some point, I dozed off. Dawn was breaking when I jerked awake from another dream of surging waves. The compass felt icy cold in my hand, a stark contrast to the burn I'd felt before. My heart hammered with dread. A stinging realization pricked my consciousness. The object I had scoffed at as mere superstition had begun to steer my life as surely as it had once guided an admiral on the high seas. It was no longer just a tool. It was an entity, one that thrived on secrets and fear. I decided to confront it. Standing in my living room, legs trembling, I stared down at the time-worn brass. My breathing was shallow, and my muscles tightened. I remembered the hologram of the roiling ocean, the document stamped with imminent insubordination. I recognized that the compass was warning me or pushing me, maybe both. I vowed never to open another anonymous email. I would keep my head down, do my job, and not allow the compass to dictate my path. It wouldn't be easy, but I had to try. The final jolt of fear coursed through me when I felt a low vibration from the compass in my hand. The needle moved away from my chest and pointed at the door to my apartment. It was a chilling reminder that the cycle hadn't broken, but this time, I didn't follow. My heart pounded like a drum. My breath caught in my throat, yet I stood firm. For a moment, I thought I heard the faint crashing of distant waves. My palms dampened as I tightened my grip on the compass. And then slowly, the needle swung back to my heart, as if accepting my refusal. I looked around my apartment, half expecting to see spectral water lapping at the walls. But there was only the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the first gray light of day leaking through the blinds, and my own ragged breath. My skin was still prickling with latent adrenaline, and an uneasy calm settled over me. A realization hit me. Maybe the real torment wasn't the compass itself, but the knowledge it carried, the secrets it revealed about my workplace and my own uncertainties. As my pulse gradually slowed, I felt neither relief nor triumph. What I felt was a disquieting awareness that I had merged with this relic in some inexplicable way. Even now, as I stand here in the morning light, compass in hand, I sense a new wave of dread building. The next Friday will come soon enough, and I know exactly what will happen at 4:40 p.m. But I'm determined this time. I refuse to be a puppet to its supernatural whims. If the illusions come, let them come. If emails flood my inbox, so be it. I've decided not to run. My skin is clammy, my heart pounding, and a tremor runs through my fingers. Yet I won't give in. The compass points at me like an accusing finger, but I won't let it command me anymore. A final uneasy thought gnaws at my mind. What if the compass isn't done revealing its purpose? What if those swirling visions of a cursed ocean and mutinous crews are only fragments of a deeper conspiracy waiting to surface? I can't know for sure. All I can do is brace myself, heart racing and palms sweating, for the next storm it conjures. Somehow, I suspect this voyage, whatever it may be, is far from over, and that is what truly terrifies me. Story 5. The darkness wasn't just absence of light, it was a presence. I felt it coiling around me the moment the power cut, plunging my apartment building into absolute blackness. My phone's flashlight offered brief reassurance until I found my emergency candles. The tiny flames painted twisted shadows across my walls, more alive than they had any right to be. That February night brought an unexpected ice storm. Tree branches snapped under the weight of frozen rain, and power lines surrendered throughout the city. I'd experienced blackouts before, but something about this one felt wrong. A primal warning that prickled at the back of my neck. I tried to rationalize my growing unease. The building was just settling in the cold. The wind was playing tricks through old ventilation shafts. But the sounds from upstairs didn't fit these explanations. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crossed the ceiling. My ceiling, which should have been impossible. I lived on the top floor. There was nothing above me but the maintenance access to the roof, unoccupied and locked. The footsteps continued, followed by a soft scraping sound. My heart accelerated as I strained to identify it. It reminded me of fingernails dragging across textured wallpaper, but amplified. The candles flickered despite the absence of any draft. casting monstrous shapes that seemed to reach toward me. I should have called someone, but cell service was spotty during storms, and the building's emergency landline was in the lobby, 3 floors down. Besides, who would I call? The super wouldn't venture out in this weather for strange noises. Police would dismiss it as the building creaking. I needed to investigate myself. I hesitated, weighing options that all felt wrong. The building was over 100 years old, renovated multiple times with questionable workmanship. Perhaps someone had accessed the roof maintenance area illegally, seeking shelter from the storm, or worse, they had broken in knowing the security system would be compromised by the outage. As I gathered courage to investigate, something new began. A sound so out of place it froze the breath in my lungs. Voices, distant yet distinct, echoed down the stairwell outside my apartment. The words were incomprehensible, the cadence rhythmic and measured. Latin, I realized, recognizing the patterns from my university courses years ago. Not conversational Latin, but something liturgical, ritualistic chanting that rose and fell with unnerving precision. My mouth went dry as I moved toward my door. The rational part of my brain cataloged possible explanations. A recording from another apartment, Catholic seminary students from 2 blocks over seeking shelter, my own mind creating patterns from the storm's ambient noise. None felt convincing, especially as the chanting grew louder, more insistent. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the dropping temperature. My hands trembled as I lit a larger candle and placed it in a hurricane lamp. I grabbed my keys and a heavy flashlight, for illumination and, if necessary, defense. The hallway outside my apartment was a void. My candle revealed only a few feet ahead, the flame's corona barely reaching the walls. The chanting had subsided, but the footsteps above remained, traversing directly over the hallway ceiling now. I approached the stairwell, each step forward a battle against instinct urging retreat. The stairs ascended into absolute darkness. I raised my light, revealing scuffed steps and peeling paint, but nothing out of the ordinary. The temperature dropped noticeably with each step upward. My breath fogged before me, crystallizing in the beam of my flashlight. The higher I climbed, the colder it became, until my fingers stiffened around the lamp handle and my ears ached from the chill. The maintenance door at the top stood closed but unlocked, its padlock hanging open on the hasp. This detail sent a shock of adrenaline through me. Someone had been here, recently. I considered turning back, calling for help somehow, but curiosity and indignation overwhelmed caution. This was my building, my home. I needed to know. I pushed the door open with the flashlight. The maintenance corridor stretched before me, windowless and confined. It should have been empty. It was empty, but the evidence of intrusion was unmistakable. Wet boot prints marked the concrete floor, but they made no logical pattern. Some appeared on the walls, others on the ceiling, as if someone, or something, had walked across every surface with impossible gravity. Most disturbing were the handprints, enormous impressions, half again as large as my own hand, stamped in what looked like wet clay, but couldn't have been. They clustered primarily on the ceiling, 5-fingered but wrongly proportioned, with elongated digits and oddly jointed thumbs positioned at unnatural angles. My candle flame bent horizontally, drawn toward something at the corridor's end despite the absence of any perceptible draft. The temperature continued to plummet until each breath became painful, my lungs rejecting the frigid air. The footsteps had stopped, but a new sound emerged, a wet, sliding noise like something heavy being dragged through water. I advanced slowly, struggling against every instinct screaming for retreat. The flashlight beam weakened, its batteries surrendering to the unnatural cold. The candlelight revealed less and less as its flame shrank to a desperate blue flicker. In the dimming light, the handprints seemed to pulse with their own faint luminescence. Then, without warning, electricity surged through the building. The corridor's single bulb flashed to life for a fraction of a second before dying again. But that momentary illumination was enough. I saw it, clinging to the ceiling at the corridor's end. A mass of shadow somehow denser than the darkness surrounding it. Not simply dark, but an absence more profound than mere lack of light. A negation that hurt my eyes to perceive. It had a form, though one that defied anatomical sense. Limbs bent at impossible angles, too many joints arranged in meaningless configurations. Its proportions stretched and compressed as it moved, flowing across the ceiling like spilled ink, but with purpose, deliberate, intelligent purpose. In that fractional moment of illumination, it became aware of me. The mass oriented what might have been its front toward my position. I didn't see eyes, but felt its attention lock onto me with physical weight. Then the light died, leaving only my guttering candle against absolute darkness. I ran. Blind panic overrode everything else. I dropped the flashlight, clutching only the candle as I stumbled back toward the stairs. Behind me, the wet sliding sound accelerated, accompanied by a new noise, a hollow, rattling inhalation like air forced through desiccated tissue. My foot caught on the top stair, and I nearly fell headlong down the stairwell. I caught myself against the wall, the impact nearly extinguishing my candle. The flame sputtered, dim blue-white, providing just enough light to navigate the steps. I descended recklessly, risking a fall to escape whatever pursued me. The temperature rose with each step downward. By the landing, my breath no longer fogged. The sliding sound faded, replaced by that ritualistic chanting again, closer now, emanating from somewhere in the space between walls. Words in ancient Latin looped and repeated, the syllables distorted as if spoken through water. I reached my floor and sprinted to my apartment, hands shaking so violently I struggled with the keys. Inside, I slammed the door and engaged every lock, then wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. My heart hammered painfully against my ribs, each beat resonating through my entire body. I retreated to the bathroom, the most insulated room, with no windows or external walls, and wedged my back against the door. Time lost meaning as I sat there, listening for sounds of pursuit that never materialized. The candle burned down to nothing, leaving me in darkness again, clutching my phone with its fading battery. I forced myself to regulate my breathing, counting inhales and exhales until the roaring panic subsided enough to think. What had I seen? My mind cycled through explanations, each less plausible than the last. Hallucination from carbon monoxide? But the building used electric heating. Sleep deprivation? I'd been well rested before the outage. A prank by trespassers? No human could move that way, could leave handprints on a ceiling. Eventually, rationality reasserted itself enough to recognize that whatever I'd encountered hadn't followed me down. I was safe, at least momentarily. I needed to contact someone, but my phone battery had dropped to 3%. I had to conserve it until power returned or until morning, when I could safely leave. I'm not sure how long I sat there, cycling between terror and exhaustion. At some point, I must have dozed, despite my determination to remain vigilant. I woke to the sudden hum of electricity returning, lights blinking on throughout my apartment. Normalcy rushed back with jarring speed. The refrigerator motor kicked in. Heating vents sighed to life. Digital clocks blinked for reset. Ordinary, explicable sounds that somehow felt like an obscene pretense after what I'd experienced. I cautiously emerged from the bathroom. My apartment appeared unchanged, everything in its place. Outside, the storm had subsided. Moonlight filtered through breaking clouds, casting silver rectangles on my living room floor. I should have left then, found a hotel for the night, but a compulsion drove me back upstairs. I needed verification, needed to prove to myself that what I'd seen was somehow explicable in the harsh clarity of electric light. The maintenance corridor was exactly as I remembered, except for the handprints. They remained, unmistakable and undeniable, pressed into the ceiling as if the plaster had been soft clay when they were made. In places, the impressions penetrated nearly an inch deep, exposing lathe and ancient wiring above. There was no sign of the entity itself, no evidence of its passage beyond those marks. I photographed everything with my phone, hands still unsteady. The images were poor quality in the dim emergency lighting, but they captured enough. Proof that something had been there, that I hadn't imagined it all. Building management sent maintenance workers the next day. I showed them the corridor, watched their expressions shift from annoyance to confusion to unease. They had no explanation for the handprints, for their placement or depth. One worker, older than the others, made a warning gesture when he thought no one was looking. He refused to stay after sunset, leaving a repair job half-finished. 3 weeks have passed. The handprints remain, despite attempts to plaster over them. The new material won't adhere, falling away overnight to reveal those same impressions beneath. Management is planning more extensive renovations, talking about water damage and structural issues, explanations that satisfy bureaucratic requirements, but address nothing of what actually happened. I still live here, though I've applied for transfers to other buildings. Where would I go, really? How could I explain my urgency without sounding unstable? I've found no historical records of similar incidents, though the building's original blueprints show unusual modifications to the top floor during a 1923 renovation. Subdivided spaces that don't appear in modern plans. The power has remained stable since that night, but sometimes during storms, the lights flicker momentarily. In those microseconds of darkness, I sense movement at the edges of my vision, a fluidity in the shadows that shouldn't exist. And on the quietest nights, when the city's ambient noise subsides, I hear it again. That rhythmic Latin chanting, distant but distinct, rising from somewhere within the walls. I've taken to sleeping with lights on. I've installed backup battery systems for essential circuits. I've learned the Latin words for warding and protection, though I don't believe in such things. Not officially. But I recite them anyway, when darkness falls and the ceiling creaks with weight that shouldn't exist. Because the handprints are spreading, multiplying slowly across the maintenance corridor ceiling. And sometimes in the morning, I find plaster dust on the floor outside my apartment, directly beneath new indentations forming in my own ceiling. Story 6. A low hum resonated through my cramped study the moment I flicked on the old AM radio. The air felt heavier, as though it were pressing inward from all sides, and the corners of the room seemed darker than usual. Even the usually comforting scent of dusty books and vintage ink ribbons turned stale, laced with an electric tension that made my skin crawl. Something was off-kilter, something beyond ordinary explanation, and I could sense it in the tiny vibrations that traveled up my arms, in the erratic pounding of my heart, and in the faint creaking protest that came from the olive-green Olivetti typewriter perched on my desk. I've been collecting typewriters for nearly a decade. Some people collect antique coins, others vinyl records, but there is a certain charm in mechanical keyboards that translates thought into the tactile, metallic clack of letters on paper. Each machine carries the spirit of a bygone era, little glimpses of history manifested in their chipped paint and worn keys. Of all my beloved devices, the Olivetti, with its olive green casing and graceful curves, should have been my crown jewel. But from the moment I acquired it, I felt something unsettling lingering in its presence. I couldn't place it at first. Perhaps it was the dull gleam in its keys, or the faint smell of old lubricant that never quite matched the others. Yet I ignored these instinctive warnings, chalking them up to my own overactive imagination. After all, the reason I collect these machines is that they keep me grounded in the tangible world of ink and paper. How could one be sinister? That was before I discovered that the Olivetti reacted strangely to my AM radio broadcasts. At first it was subtle. Whenever I turned the radio dial to pick up late-night stations, the typewriter would emit a soft ping or skip a letter if I was in the middle of typing. But then the phenomenon escalated to the point where it began typing on its own if the radio was on. Not a playful skip or an accidental carriage shift. Actual text. The sounds would begin as a faint tapping, not unlike the scuttling of a rodent in the walls, then evolve into rapid-fire keystrokes that made my hair stand on end. It typed single words in Latin that I couldn't quite decipher, fragments of phrases that sounded archaic and strangely authoritative, like lines from an old forbidden text. Then, just as suddenly, it interspersed these ominous Latin words with short English lines that resembled headlines of newspapers, some of which I recognized only the next day, when I flipped through the morning press. The first time I noticed this precognitive aspect, I told myself it was a coincidence. No old machine could possibly produce tomorrow's headlines through supernatural means. I rationalized that perhaps I'd read speculation about a political scandal, or a local event the night before, and my drowsy mind was playing tricks. But I couldn't ignore that the specific wording, even the punctuation, matched perfectly. Each letter hammered out by that mechanical, unfeeling device. And if I dared to turn off the radio mid-typing, the Olivetti responded with a low, groaning noise, like a living creature in the throes of some painful spasm. The first time I heard that noise, my breathing hitched. The machine was never plugged into anything except for the occasional replacement spool of ribbon. It had no electricity. Its entire function was mechanical and manual. Or it should have been. After several uneasy nights, I told myself that I was just overstressed. My coffee intake soared, I slept with the lights on, and each time I passed by the study, I swore the Olivetti was watching me with silent, judgmental eyes. This creeping paranoia slithered through my daily routine. I found myself checking all my other typewriters to ensure none of them were acting similarly. Of course, they sat inert, unresponsive as ever. But the Olivetti felt different. At one point, I decided to test my theory in the bright light of midday, hoping that the sunshine would drain away the menacing aura. I turned on the AM radio, letting static crackle from an old station. Almost instantly, the typewriter's platen spun, and it typed out, "Civitas fervet, Licinia cecidit." I recognized none of the Latin words, but the line that followed turned my stomach cold. Train station closed after unusual sinkhole discovered. That very afternoon, I overheard a neighbor mention a sudden sinkhole near the old station, forcing an unplanned closure. My body went rigid with dread, sweat beating at my temples. Anxiety began to seep into every aspect of my life. I started double-checking all my appliances to avoid short circuits or gas leaks. I locked my windows, certain that some unknown presence might slip in while I slept. One morning, before heading to the kitchen, I found a sheet in the Olivetti, fresh with typed text. It listed a series of times and accidents so trivial that I might have dismissed them. Except each line matched something that nearly happened to me over the previous week, incidents I had shrugged off as unfortunate close calls. Slipping in the shower at 7:43 a.m., nearly cutting my finger with a kitchen knife at 8:10 a.m., scalding coffee almost overflowing onto my wrist at 8:30 a.m. Each was avoided by a fraction of a moment, or a last-second shift in attention. Reading it, I felt the hair rise at the nape of my neck. My breath became shallow, and I could practically hear my heart pounding in my ears. I wanted to leave the house, abandon my entire collection, or at least stay away from that cursed typewriter. But in some twisted way, I was also riveted by it, impossibly curious to see if what it printed next might shed any rational explanation, or at least confirm I wasn't losing my mind. I tried to ignore the pages it churned out whenever the radio was on, but by ignoring them, I only seemed to agitate the machine further. One evening, as I considered unplugging the radio for good, the Olivetti responded with a violent thrashing of its keys. Its ink ribbons whipped out like serpents, striking my wrist and curling around it with enough force to leave a mark. The pain was startlingly real, and I felt the sticky residue of ink soaking into my sleeve. My breath caught in my throat as I wrestled free of the ribbons. The typewriter hissed, a sound that rose from its metal casing, a tortured squeal of mechanical defiance. I yanked the radio dial off, plunging the room into a profound silence, broken only by my own ragged breathing. I tried to reassure myself that everything was fine, that maybe I had left some mechanism jammed. But I couldn't deny the fresh red line around my wrist, stained with black ink. It ached for days, a constant pulsing reminder of what I had witnessed. That night, sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the Olivetti's keys striking the platen, seemingly guided by invisible hands. Several days later, I woke to the sound of a single dull clack. I stepped into the study, and there it was, a new sheet of paper in the carriage. The text was short, but it seemed to mock me. Lunch hour, indefinite. Beneath that was a tiny, cryptic signature composed of micro-perforations. Running my fingertips over the paper, I felt them catch on raised bumps, an irregular pattern that resembled tiny pinpricks forming an illegible scrawl. My stomach churned, and an acidic tang rose in the back of my throat. I suddenly felt caged in my own home, the walls pressing in, the air stifling. There was an unshakable sensation that the Olivetti was trying to rewrite my schedule, intruding on the mundane details of my life, as if orchestrating my fate. Time turned sluggish as I tiptoed around every corner, worried the machine might lash out again. My footsteps became hesitant. Even everyday chores like washing dishes or tidying up left me jumpy, imagining I heard faint clicks or metallic scrapes in the distance. At night, the house grew oppressive, full of looming shadows and faint echoes that I couldn't pinpoint. Sometimes I thought I saw movement at the study door, the flicker of something metallic in the dim light. My breath would catch, my heart hammering so violently I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. When I mustered the courage to flick the light switch, the corridor and study lay empty as always, the Olivetti perched on the desk like a sentinel. I started questioning my own senses. I would recount the events in my head, the typewriter typing by itself, the predictions, the ink ribbon coiling around my wrist. Could I be hallucinating? I found myself narrating the story to an acquaintance over the phone, though I gave only half-truths. I said one of my typewriters seemed to be in disrepair and was acting up when exposed to radio frequencies. That friend suggested a mechanical glitch triggered by electromagnetic interference. They recommended that I dispose of it or keep it in a metal container. I offered non-committal thanks and ended the call, telling myself that maybe I should just do that. Yet a deeper fear took root. I suspected the Olivetti would not tolerate any attempt to get rid of it. Hoping to starve the bizarre connection, I stopped turning on the radio. Initially, the machine stayed dormant, though a tension seemed to saturate the air whenever I was in the same room. I tried to go back to my routine, waking, eating, writing letters on a different typewriter, avoiding the Olivetti altogether. For a few days, it appeared content, or at least inactive. But on the third day, I heard that familiar creaking noise, like an animal in pain. The sound came from the study. My throat tightened, every hair on my body bristling. I stepped in to find the Olivetti's carriage shifting, its keys pressing down on nothing because I had removed the paper. It was as if it were starved for attention, straining to produce some message that couldn't be formed. Despite the trembling in my hands, I slid a fresh sheet into the carriage. The moment the paper touched the platen, the machine unleashed a flurry of keystrokes. I recoiled, stumbling backward and nearly knocking over a stack of manuals. When the typing stopped, I forced myself to read the new lines. They described changes in my day-to-day tasks, waking up earlier, skipping meals, avoiding phone calls. It even mentioned minor modifications, like leaving certain lights off. It read like a twisted schedule penned by someone studying my habits in the darkest corners of my life. A sense of claustrophobia washed over me. My stomach lurched, and sweat broke out along my hairline as I realized how intimately the Olivetti seemed to know me. It was dissecting every detail of my routine. Terror gnawed at my sanity. Could it see me? Was it controlling me, or simply predicting my moves? My breath came in shallow rasps, and my vision tunneled. I felt an overwhelming urge to run, to break free of this mechanical tyrant. Yet I also feared what might happen if I didn't comply. What if ignoring it led to more violent outbursts? I remembered the ribbon slashing across my wrist. My entire arm ached with the memory, and even the ghost of that stinging sensation was enough to pin me in place. In desperation, I decided to face it head-on. I turned on the AM radio, letting its static coat the air, and glared at the Olivetti. My heart pounded so loudly that the station's crackle was barely audible over the roar in my ears. Within seconds, the machine responded, hammering out words in a frenzy of metallic clicks. Latin phrases melded with snippets that sounded suspiciously like the next day's media headlines. An electrical glitch in the city's grid, an unexpected policy announcement from a local official. Then, more personal lines emerged, detailing what time I would attempt to leave the house, which neighbor's voice I'd overhear, how I might trip over a loose floorboard in the hallway. Each line felt like a prophecy, not necessarily catastrophic, but undeniably invasive. Fighting back panic, I forced myself to remain calm. My breathing was shallow, but I tried to even it out, inhaling through my nose, exhaling through clenched teeth. My hands shook, clammy with sweat, as I tore the fresh page from the platen. The keys jammed briefly, letting out a guttural groan. The radio station hissed and squealed with static. In that moment, I realized the typewriter might be tethered to the radio frequency like a parasite latching onto a host. Maybe if I disrupted that signal somehow. I took the page and sprinted, down the hall, away from the study. My pulse galloped in my chest. I tossed the radio's power cord over my shoulder to yank it from the socket as I moved. Silence enveloped me, but I could almost sense the Olivetti trembling in the other room, incensed by my defiance. I half expected the ribbons to lash out again, or the keys to pound wildly even in the silence. But nothing happened. Still, I couldn't stand still. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, and my legs felt as though they might give out. Several uneasy hours later, after pacing around my living room, I returned to the study. My insides twisted with dread. The machine sat motionless, its keys unpressed, the carriage resting at the margin. It looked like any other antique typewriter. Yet the air tasted of rust and electricity, an acrid smell that burned the back of my throat. I gently removed the half-typed page. The final line read, "His schedule, indefinite." Then the same perforated signature, faint pinpricks at the bottom of the sheet, barely visible yet undeniably there. I packed the Olivetti into a crate. My entire body trembled with a feverish intensity as I sealed it shut and dragged it into a corner of the basement. My breath felt scorching hot in my lungs, and a wave of dizziness made me stumble. I didn't expect that to solve anything permanently, but the sense of relief was immediate, like locking away something menacing, even if only behind thin planks of wood. I left the basement light on, though it flickered, intensifying my feeling that nothing about this was truly finished. Nonetheless, I forced myself upstairs, grabbed a glass of water, and sat on the couch, trying to calm the trembling in my limbs. My chest felt tight, as though the house itself was pressing in on me. Late that night, with all the radios and TVs off, I swear I heard a faint tapping echoing through the floorboards. My mouth went dry, and my heartbeat thundered. Every nerve in my body braced for another confrontation. Minutes stretched on, but the tapping never repeated. Eventually, I allowed my shoulders to slump, half expecting the quiet to be some sort of trick. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, wrestling with the lingering possibility that the Olivetti wasn't just an inert machine. Whether I was the victim of some unexplained phenomenon or creeping madness, I couldn't say for certain. But the final typed words echoed in my mind. Indefinite. The notion I might be locked in a perpetual stalemate with this relic haunted me far more than any fleeting sense of terror. In the following days, I avoided the basement altogether. My house felt emptier without the drone of the AM radio. I missed the everyday hum of static that once provided a comforting background noise. Now silence reigned, broken only by my shallow breathing and the occasional squeak of old floorboards. I tried resuming my normal life, grocery shopping, reading, checking emails. But some part of me remained on edge, as though expecting the crate to burst open at any moment, unleashing the mechanical horror I had entombed there. Eventually, I caught my reflection in a hallway mirror and barely recognized myself. Sunken cheeks, dark circles under wild eyes. I realized I was living in fear of an object I should have had complete power over. Some nights, I caught myself standing at the top of the basement stairs, drawn by an inexplicable pull. I'd stand there in the half-light, heart pounding, imagining the Olivetti tapping away inside its crate, ready to forecast my next step or twist my routine. I never did open that door, but each time I approached, I felt a prickle at the back of my neck, as though the machine was calling out in silent defiance. To this day, I can't be near an AM broadcast without a spike of anxiety roiling my gut. I still collect typewriters, but none rival the uncanny presence of that olive green Olivetti. Sometimes, in the dark quiet of my bedroom, I lie awake, replaying each frantic keystroke in my memory and wondering if I escaped or merely delayed the inevitable. I've managed to keep living with some semblance of normalcy, though the fear still shadows me. There is no guarantee that I have seen the last of those cryptic Latin passages or harrowing predictions. And the truth is, even if I wanted to, I'm not sure how I could ever sever that connection. Because once a machine tastes your secrets, once it latches onto your future, how do you wrest control of your own destiny back? The house is mine, the collection is mine, my life is mine. But each night, as I shut off the lights, I feel the phantom presence of that Olivetti, sealed away below my feet. A mechanical heart that thrums with static and malevolent intent, waiting. And I can't shake the suspicion that it's merely biding its time, ready to strike again the moment I let my guard down. That knowledge sits in my mind like a malignant tumor, impossible to remove, forever reminding me that I might not be the one who types my own story after all. Story 7. The first time I noticed something was deeply wrong with my new aquarium. I felt an almost electric jolt of dread shoot through my spine. It wasn't just the sight of luminous silhouettes shifting in the water, carp-shaped apparitions flickering with unnatural iridescence. It was the way they moved against a current that shouldn't have existed. The entire room seemed to pulse whenever the water level rose at exactly 9:09 p.m., as if the place itself were breathing in unison with those ghostly shapes. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my temples, and cold sweat prickled along my forehead. Even the taste in my mouth turned metallic, my throat scratchy and dry. The moment I set eyes on that aquarium, I sensed an unexplained presence clinging to the glass, something that mocked reality in a way that made my skin crawl. I bought this aquarium used, thinking it would help me unwind after work. My plan was simple: set it on a sturdy table, fill it with clear water, and introduce a few small fish. Something calming, like neon tetras or guppies. I believed that watching them glide around would soothe my nerves. Instead, the first night after I brought it home, I stood in the living room, transfixed by the water's dim glow. Nothing else in the apartment was turned on. There was no filter inside, no tubes, no pump, nothing that could create a current. Yet the water shifted in gentle swells, the surface rippling in a hypnotic pattern. Then I saw the outlines of carp appear, faint at first, like after images behind my eyelids. They floated gracefully, their fins undulating in some inaudible tide. I remember leaning in, my breath fogging the glass, and my stomach clenched when I realized there was no physical fish inside. These were silhouettes made of shimmering light, swimming where there should have been only empty water. At first, I wondered if my mind was playing tricks. Perhaps I was exhausted, or maybe there was some chemical residue from previous owners that made the water behave strangely. I shook my head and tried to dismiss the visions as a trick of reflections. Yet I couldn't tear my eyes away, my pulse accelerating, sweat beating on my scalp. The hair on the back of my neck stood up in that primal reaction to something I couldn't rationalize. It was as if the aquarium was breathing, subtly expanding and contracting in the darkness. The second night, I decided to put real fish in there, hoping to ground the experience in something normal. I picked up a few goldfish from a local store. The employee had told me these were hardy and easy to care for. When I got home, I carefully transferred them into the tank. Instead of exploring their new environment, the fish became eerily still, almost as if they'd been placed in a deep freeze. Their gills moved, but they hung in one corner, unblinking and rigid. Meanwhile, those spectral carp silhouettes came to life right beside them. They glowed a pale green this time, resembling radioactive shadows. The illusion swirled around the real fish, weaving in and out, as if mocking the living creature's inability to swim. My heart hammered against my ribcage. I found my mouth growing dry as I watched, breath catching in my throat. It felt like watching a predator circle its prey, only I couldn't sense any malice, just a cold, otherworldly indifference. Then, at exactly 9:09 p.m., the aquarium water surged upward by what looked like 5 centimeters. I heard the faintest gurgling, like a miniature tidal wave. I half expected the water to spill over, but it didn't overflow. Instead, it lapped the edges and then slid back down, leaving rivulets of moisture across the glass top. My hand instinctively rose to wipe sweat from my brow, and I found my fingers trembling. I checked the time on my phone, holding it under the glow of a standing lamp in the corner. The screen read 9:10 by the time the water settled, and in that single minute, I was overwhelmed by a sense of something impossibly old, something that had followed the aquarium from its previous home into mine. I paced around the room, trying to calm my pounding heart, but every attempt to breathe slowly only made me more aware of how stifling the air felt. After that incident, I was reluctant to touch the aquarium again, but curiosity gnawed at me. I touched the glass the following evening just to see if there was any temperature change or unusual residue. The moment my palm met the surface, I felt a crushing force, as though I dipped my hand into the bottom of the ocean. My eardrums vibrated with deep pressure, and all I could hear was a low, resonant sound, like the call of a whale echoing through miles of empty sea. My stomach twisted, and my skin broke into goosebumps. I felt as if I might collapse, my breath ragged and my legs shaky. Then, just as abruptly, the sensation vanished. It left me gasping for air, unsteady on my feet with sweat rolling down my face. I rushed to the kitchen sink to splash water on my cheeks. The drain gurgled and, impossibly, I heard the same distant whale-like chant reverberating through the pipes. I clutched the edge of the sink, trying to keep myself upright. The sound lingered until 9:10 p.m. arrived, at which point it abruptly cut out, leaving my apartment oppressively silent. Over the following days, my sense of dread grew. The aquarium remained in the living room, though sometimes I considered locking it in a closet or even smashing it to pieces. But something prevented me from taking any drastic action. A vague fascination with its unnatural qualities mingled with my fear, binding me to the tank in a horrible cycle of anxiety and curiosity. I started to notice more bizarre details. The ghostly carp changed color depending on the night, shifting from green to bluish white, and sometimes a deep crimson hue that made my skin prickle. They swam in silent patterns, forming shapes that looked like alien script projected onto the walls, flickering like sonar waves. My goldfish remained motionless whenever those apparitions were present. Their eyes were blank, as if they were in some kind of suspended animation. Around 9:09 p.m. each night, the water rose again, unstoppable and precise. It reminded me of ocean tides or ancient rituals. The moment it happened, I felt my heart race and cold sweat soak my shirt. My throat constricted, and I found myself gripping the arm of my couch until my knuckles went white. My imagination ran wild. I pictured the water bursting free and flooding the apartment with an otherworldly brine. I felt watched, not just by the aquatic phantoms, but by something greater behind them, something anchored in the darkest depths of the sea. I tried explaining my experience to a coworker one afternoon. I kept my voice low, describing how the aquarium seemed haunted or cursed, and how the water rose each night at the same time. My coworker must have seen the panic in my eyes because he suggested I look into the history of the aquarium. He also mentioned in a half-joking tone that maybe I should sell it again. I remember nodding, but my mind was too cluttered with images of glowing fish and swirling tides to hold any normal conversation. I must have sounded delirious. My coworker gave me a sympathetic glance, telling me to take it easy and maybe consult a professional if it got worse. His words echoed in my head as I made my way home, chest tight, palms sweaty, feeling a strange compulsion to return to that tank. That night, the sense of oppression was thicker than ever. The air in my apartment felt stale, and each time I tried to inhale, it was like breathing through a damp cloth. I turned on every light I could, as if the brightness would banish the aquarium's ghostly influences, but that only made the contrast starker. Beyond the lamps and ceiling fixtures, the water still glowed with its own eerie luminescence. The apparitions seemed even more vibrant, their outlines pulsing in rhythm with my racing heart. I noticed my reflection in the glass, pale and gaunt, my eyes ringed by dark circles. For a moment, I wondered if I was losing my sanity, if maybe I'd conjured all of this in the throes of overwork or loneliness. Yet the weight of that pressure I'd felt, the calls echoing in the pipes, those were too tangible to be mere figments of a tired mind. I tried to ignore the tank for the rest of the evening, pacing around my living room to keep from staring into it. But just before 9:09 p.m., I felt compelled to watch. My stomach churned with dread, beads of sweat forming on my forehead. When the water rose this time, I leaned in. Instead of 5 centimeters, it surged higher, maybe 7 or 8. My pulse thundered, and my breathing became shallow, each inhale feeling like a spike in my chest. The sound of water against glass was louder now, like a riptide snarling just beneath the surface. The ghostly carp flared in intense shades of red and gold, swirling rapidly. I could see reflections on the walls, shifting lines that reminded me of arcane runes. The entire apartment felt like a submarine sinking under unimaginable pressure. As I watched, water spilled onto the glass top, trickling down the sides in rivulets. My chest tightened, a primal fear screaming at me to run. Yet I couldn't move. It was as though I were held in place by a dense gravitational field emanating from that aquarium. I braced myself for an overflow, but again, it didn't happen. The water receded like a controlled tide. A moment later, the ghost carp swam in slow figure eights. The real fish remained stuck in their catatonic corner, occasionally flapping a fin but otherwise lifeless in all but name. I sensed a low hum, like the aftershock of a distant explosion, resonating through the room. My teeth chattered from the vibration. The taste of iron settled on my tongue, and my hands felt clammy. At work the next day, I couldn't focus. The memories of that bizarre tidal surge and the monstrous hum wouldn't leave me. My heart raced whenever I thought about the aquarium's luminescent fish. My mind darted with paranoid suspicions. Was I the only one seeing this? Could the neighbors sense the vibrations? Did this phenomenon stop with my apartment walls? Or was it seeping into the plumbing, echoing out to other units? My coworker tried to ask how I was doing, but I only gave vague responses. I made up excuses for my jitteriness, feigning a cold or a bad night's sleep. But inside, I felt like the walls were closing in. My palms stayed sweaty, and my breath came in shallow gasps whenever I pictured the next confrontation with that thing in my living room. Still, I refused to leave the aquarium entirely alone. A sick fascination drove me to investigate. I rummaged through the internet for articles or stories about haunted aquariums, cursed objects, or weird aquatic phenomena. Nothing matched exactly. I found plenty of ghost stories, some about lakes or sunken ships, but nothing about an aquarium that manifested phantom fish and rose with the precision of a possessed tide. The more I scrolled, the more I felt an ache in my temples, a tension headache that pulsed in time with my anxious heartbeat. Every so often I'd catch myself checking the clock, anticipating the next 9:09. On the 7th night, I decided to face it head on. I turned off all the lights in the apartment, leaving only the faint glow of the aquarium. The water shimmered with a dull luminescence, and the spectral carp were faint, but visible. My pulse pounded in my ears. My breathing came fast, chest rising and falling in sharp jerks. I settled into a chair just a few feet away, forcing myself to remain still, ignoring the sweat gathering at my temples. The minutes ticked by. At 9:08, I stood, approaching the glass with tentative steps. My stomach clenched so hard I felt nauseated, and the tips of my fingers tingled with adrenaline. At 9:09, the water began its ascent. I could see my distorted reflection in the tank, wide eyes, sweat-drenched brow. The silhouettes glowed fiercely, shifting from a cool blue to a searing gold. I pressed my hand to the glass again, determined not to pull back. The moment I touched it, that crushing deep-sea pressure returned, forcing the breath from my lungs in a ragged wheeze. My mind swam with disorienting images. Sunken wrecks, flickering lights in a black abyss, and the sound of a whale's cry echoing through endless darkness. My head felt like it was about to explode. My heart hammered so violently I feared it might burst through my rib cage. Yet I held on, palm flattened against the aquarium wall. The ghostly carp swarmed around my hand, swirling in frantic circles. Their color intensified, almost blinding, and I sensed a presence pressing in from all sides. It was ancient, unknowable, and it felt like it was staring through me, peeling back layers of my being to examine my essence. In that moment, my vision blurred, and I might have blacked out for a second or two. When I regained clarity, my mouth was bone dry, my arms shaking uncontrollably. A dull roar filled my ears, like 1,000 rushing currents merging into one. I snatched my hand away from the glass and stumbled backward, nearly toppling over the chair. My entire body trembled as though I'd been submerged in freezing water. My shirt stuck to my back, soaked with sweat. I tasted salt on my lips, and I had to gulp down air just to keep from collapsing. Suddenly, the roaring ceased. The water began to descend, returning to its usual level. The carp silhouettes faded, their luminous bodies dissolving into the dimness. My goldfish twitched, as if waking from a nightmare, and resumed a slow, uncertain swim. For a moment, the living room was so silent I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my skull. My breath was raspy, and I realized my legs felt too weak to support me. I sank into the chair, every muscle throbbing with tension. I sat there for what felt like hours, a cold clamminess coating my skin. My eyes darted around the shadowy room, half expecting something else to materialize. But nothing more happened. Finally, I realized I didn't need to understand the full scope of this aquarium's power or origins. All I knew was that it was wrong. A window to something that thrived in impossible depths. My nerve was shredded, my mind teetering between terror and an unshakable curiosity. But in that quiet aftermath, I made a decision. I couldn't coexist with this thing, whatever it was. The very next morning, I drained the tank. The ghostly carp didn't appear. No phantom shapes flickered in the receding water. My goldfish, freed from the aquarium's strange influence, swam calmly in a separate bowl nearby. I wiped the glass walls clean, my hands still trembling. I wrapped the empty aquarium in heavy blankets and drove it out of my apartment. Despite the fear gnawing at me, I felt an odd sense of relief as I placed it in storage several miles away. I told myself this was just temporary, that I'd figure out what to do with it eventually. But deep down, I knew I'd never want to open it again. For now, I've returned to a tentative sense of calm. My apartment feels lighter without that silent presence lurking in the corner. I haven't heard the whale-like chant in the pipes, and there have been no more unexplained surges of water. Yet every night at 9:09 I still tense up, waiting for a phantom tide. My hands sometimes shake when I recall the crushing sensation of that abyssal pressure, and when I close my eyes in the dark, I can almost see the luminous outlines of those carp, drifting through a boundless expanse of black water. The memory alone is enough to send a chill rolling through my body, goosebumps spreading across my arms. I'm left with a lingering unease, a persistent question that keeps me awake. What was that force behind the aquarium's eerie manifestations? Some nights I wonder if it's still out there, beckoning from a distance with that low, resonant call. Even now, I occasionally dream of a deep ocean, silent except for the slow pulse of enormous shapes sliding through the abyss. I wake up gasping for air, heart pounding, convinced I've heard that ominous hum in the hallway. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that certain mysteries are better left unsolved. But the memory of that aquarium, and the press of something ancient and unearthly, will stay with me, a quiet terror that reminds me how fragile our grip on reality can be. I escaped the presence, at least in a physical sense, yet part of me remains caught in its unseen currents, haunted by the silent tide that rose each night at 9:09. Story 8. From the very first second I saw the violin resting on a velvet cushion at the auction house, an unsettling chill washed over me. It was as though the instrument itself had been waiting, silent and patient, for someone to claim it. Even before I touched the polished wood, I caught a faint odor of damp earth, reminiscent of freshly dug soil after a rainstorm. The smell should have been pleasant. Nothing beats the crisp scent of wet ground, but instead, it evoked an inexplicable sense of dread. Something about that violin felt wrong, almost as if it were aware of my presence and reluctant to let me walk away. I won the bid with surprising ease. No one else seemed interested, or perhaps they were all too eager to let it go to someone else. Driving home, I propped the violin case on the passenger seat, stealing a glance at it every time I stopped at a red light. The odor was stronger in the enclosed space of my car, like a warning. Yet, the external craftsmanship was undeniably beautiful. The varnish had a warm caramel hue, though flecked with darker spots that looked suspiciously like stains. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my head was buzzing with a mixture of curiosity and mild apprehension. I felt compelled to open the case right there in the car, but I resisted. A part of me sensed that once I started playing it, there would be no going back. Stepping inside my house, I set down the case in my living room, turned on a single lamp, and opened the locks. The violin's surface shone with an unsettling sheen under the warm yellow light. I ran my hand over the wood and sniffed again, wanting to confirm the strange scent. Yes, it was unmistakably the same damp earth odor. Setting it gently on the table, I prepared the bough with rosin, noticing how quickly the rosin cake wore down, as though the bow's horsehair was unusually rough or hungry for friction. My heart thumped in my chest, an erratic, anxious beat. When I finally drew the bow across the strings for the first time, the note that emerged caught me completely off guard. I intended to play a simple open G, but what rang out was a wavering, high-pitched harmonic that set my teeth on edge. The unnatural resonance seemed to echo off the walls. My eyes darted to the violin's surface, and for an instant, I thought I saw a shift in the varnish, like something beneath it was moving. Before I could fully register that moment, I became aware of my own shadow cast across the wall behind me. And next to my outline, there was another shape, a figure with a violin tucked under its chin, mirroring my posture. Yet there was no logical source for this second shadow, no second light that could explain it. Heart pounding, I let the bow slip from my fingers. The bizarre, high-pitched harmonic abruptly ceased. Even after I put the violin away, I couldn't stop thinking about that moment. My arms felt heavy, as though they'd been drained of all strength, and my mouth went dry. I turned off the lamp and went to bed, but sleep evaded me for hours. There was a nagging sense that I wasn't alone in my own home. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me into a fitful slumber. When morning came, I convinced myself I had imagined that second shadow in the half-lit room. Still, my stomach twisted with lingering unease. Over the next few days, I tried to rationalize what had happened by telling myself I was simply out of practice, that the violin's strings and bow were reacting unpredictably to my technique. But the more I practiced in the evenings, careful, measured scales and simple arpeggios, the more I noticed bizarre, disjointed harmonics appearing where none should have been. Each time they emerged, my body erupted in goosebumps. I felt watched. I sensed a presence behind me, near me, in the corners of my vision. Once I caught a glimpse of that same phantom silhouette on the wall, playing in sync with me but never making a sound. Every time I turned to look directly at it, I found nothing there. The violin itself seemed to grow heavier in my hands. The varnish, under bright light, bore faint patterns I hadn't noticed before, almost like branching veins, and that earthy smell would intensify whenever I concentrated on these new markings. It was as though the instrument were exhaling, pulsing with some hidden life. After each session, I felt drained, covered in cold sweat. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my heart hammered like it was trying to break free from my rib cage. Late at night, when I tried to record my practice sessions, I discovered another inexplicable phenomenon. I set up a digital recorder on the music stand and played the violin for an hour, weaving simple melodies and occasionally daring to attempt more complex pieces. During playback, the track was almost entirely silent. Only a faint background hiss and what sounded like my own heartbeat thumping steadily could be heard. None of the violin notes registered. My bowing, the strings' vibration, the chords, everything was erased, replaced by the ominous rhythm of a racing pulse. But what truly unsettled me was that the heartbeat on the recording didn't match mine. I timed my pulse while listening, and the recorded pace was significantly faster, almost feverish, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. Within a week of owning the violin, I felt my sanity slipping. My dreams were plagued by flickering images of narrow corridors illuminated by an otherworldly red glow. In these nightmares, I heard the haunting strains of a violin echoing behind me, growing louder and sharper with every step I took. Each time I turned around, I saw only shifting shadows. Waking up left me breathless, my skin clammy with sweat, my throat parched. The nights blurred together, and my exhaustion made me jumpy and irritable. I hardly recognized myself in the mirror. My eyes had sunken, ringed with deep circles. Determined to fight my growing sense of dread, I decided to invite a few close friends over for a small, private performance. Just a handful of people who appreciated classical music and had no reason to doubt my abilities. I wanted them to witness the phenomenon or at least verify that I wasn't hallucinating. Maybe, I thought, if they heard those eerie harmonics or noticed the bizarre second shadow, I'd have proof I wasn't losing my mind. So, one Saturday evening, I arranged the chairs in my living room, dimmed the overhead light to create a moody atmosphere, and set out refreshments in the kitchen. Even as I waited for their arrival, that nauseating odor of wet soil seemed to permeate every corner of the house. When my guests finally gathered, I described the instrument's strange characteristics in the vaguest terms, leaving out the more disturbing details. I wanted them to listen without preconceived bias. As I raised the bow for the first note, my heart pounded so violently, I thought everyone could hear it. The opening melody was calm, though a heavy tension pressed down on the room. My friends' faces were blank, perhaps in polite concentration. But then, without warning, the violin's lower strings began to resonate independently. A series of dissonant minor notes floated through the air. I wasn't the one producing those tones. I felt the bow still on the higher strings, yet the instrument sang with impossible life. My friends shifted in their seats, clearly uneasy, though no one jumped up or spoke. The atmosphere became suffocating, as if the very air weighed more. My lungs struggled to draw breath. Despite my fear, I pressed on, letting the piece reach a crescendo. That was when I sensed it again. A presence behind me, a shape at the edge of my vision. I felt a chill tracing the length of my spine. My bow hand started to tremble, forcing me to stop abruptly. My guests simply stared, speechless. A moment later, I set the violin down and thanked them for attending, struggling to keep my voice steady. I noticed how pale they looked, like people who had just witnessed something they couldn't put into words. That night, one by one, they shared with me, through phone calls and terse messages, the same horrifying dream. A narrow corridor lit by a dim red glow, the sound of a violin echoing from behind. They all reported that it felt as though something was reaching out from the darkness, trying to touch their shoulders. Each of my friends woke up drenched in sweat. One friend confided that she felt a distinct impression of breath against her ear in the dream. None of them could pinpoint the source of the red light or the location of the corridor, but they were unanimous about the terror it invoked. Their voices, some trembling, others hushed, conveyed they believed something unearthly had happened in my living room. None of them wanted to mention it again. I barely slept that night, haunted by the knowledge that what was happening to me was spreading to those I cared about. When I finally dozed off in the early hours of the morning, I woke with a violent jolt. My pillow felt gritty against my cheek. Switching on the bedside lamp revealed streaks of rosin coating the pillow's fabric. At first, I assumed I had forgotten to wash the rosin from my hands, but as I looked closer, I saw it formed a distinct fingerprint, larger than my own, etched in white, powdery residue. Panic seized me. My pulse hammered in my ears. Something had touched my pillow, something that wasn't me. I sprang out of bed, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste to find the violin. Its case sat in the living room, locked just as I had left it. However, when I flipped it open, I noticed a residue of rosin coating the bow's hair, far more than I'd ever applied. The odor of earth was oppressive. I felt a strong, instinctive revulsion, as though I were in the presence of a living creature, not a crafted instrument. Over the following days, each time I attempted to play, the phenomenon intensified. The unplayed strings would resonate, forming morbid chords in a minor key. My muscles seized with tremors, a primal reaction to an invisible threat. My throat went dry as if I'd swallowed desert sand, and my lungs seemed to forget how to take in oxygen. Worst of all were those fleeting peripheral shadows that seemed to multiply around me. Whenever I practiced, it felt like I was in a crowd of silent observers, the walls shifting with silhouettes that jerked and writhed to the faint rhythms produced by the violin. Some nights, I swore I heard whispering in another room, but whenever I forced myself to investigate, I was greeted by emptiness. My paranoia escalated. During the day, I found it difficult to concentrate at work. My mind drifted to the violin locked away at home. I felt certain it was waiting for me. Even in bright daylight, the memory of its unsettling resonance and that second shadow, like a phantom companion, haunted me. My reflection in windows and mirrors seemed to waver with doubt. I felt perpetually watched, as if the boundaries between me and the violin had blurred. Thoughts raced through my head. Had I awakened something that lay dormant within that wood? Desperate for relief, I tried to rid myself of the violin. At first, I thought to return it to the auction house, but a quick inquiry revealed they had no record of its previous owner or origin. It was as though the instrument had simply materialized there one day, unaccounted for. I considered setting it aside, leaving it untouched, but that smell of damp earth lingered in the air, clinging to my clothes, following me from room to room like a malignant spirit. Eventually, I locked the violin in an old chest and shoved it into a dark corner of the basement. Though out of sight, it never left my thoughts. Soon, the nightmares became more frequent and more vivid. I found myself wandering that same narrow corridor of red light, hearing the screech of bow on string echoing all around. My chest tightened each time I reached the corridor's end, only to find a mirror. In the reflection, I saw not just myself, but that second form with a violin, just behind my shoulder. I'd wake up gasping for air, clutching the sheets, certain that I heard notes drifting from the basement. I could hardly tell where my dreams ended and my reality began. My heartbeat seemed perpetually elevated, my hands clammy with sweat. My entire body felt locked in a state of perpetual anxiety, anticipating the next horrifying event. One evening, with my mind on the edge of unraveling, I decided to face this thing, whatever it was, head on. I retrieved the violin from the basement, a heavy dread coiled in my stomach as I carried it upstairs to the living room. This time, I lit every lamp, determined not to allow shadows any room to lurk. My heart pounded erratically, but I forced myself to tighten the bow's hair, apply rosin, and hold the violin under my chin. As I placed the bow on the strings, I envisioned a shield of sorts around me, trying to keep my terror in check. The first few notes emerged in a quivering, quiet melody. The resonance hung in the air, thick with tension. My mind screamed at me to run, but I pushed forward, weaving a rising sequence of notes. Then I felt it, the distinctive tug of the lower strings vibrating on their own. A stark chord rang out, discordant and mournful, carrying an undercurrent of despair that seized my chest. My body shook, and tears stung my eyes. Not from sadness alone, but from a deep, primal fear of the unknown. The room seemed to darken, the overhead lights flickering as if overshadowed by some presence far greater than me. I pressed on, forcing myself to play over that chilling chord. My arms grew weak, and my breath came in shallow gulps. Through a haze of tears, I noticed a swirling shape on the living room wall, contorting like a reflection in disturbed water. It took on the silhouette of a violinist, a shape that almost matched mine. Yet it performed with a confidence and poise that I lacked, as though it were the true master of this piece. My mind teetered on the brink of panic, my rational thoughts dissolving into raw terror. The piece reached a crescendo, a shrieking collision of dissonant notes. I could barely maintain control of the bow as sweat dripped down my temples. Finally, the chaos peaked and then plunged into silence. My arms fell to my sides. My vision blurred. I sank onto a chair, the violin still clutched in my left hand, the bow trembling in my right. For several seconds, I expected the shadow to persist, to loom over me. but in the sudden quiet, I sensed the presence retreat, leaving behind a suffocating emptiness. My ears buzzed with an intense ringing. I stayed there immobile for what felt like hours. I still have that violin. Sometimes a faint hint of that damp, earthy smell resurfaces, sending my pulse racing. But for now, the house is quieter. My friends keep their distance, some admitting they still have nightmares of narrow corridors and red light. I can't blame them. There are moments when I consider taking a hammer to the violin, smashing it into splinters and burying the remains somewhere far away. Yet something holds me back. A mixture of morbid curiosity and a twisted sense that the violin belongs with me now. Deep down, I suspect that this experience has left a permanent imprint on my soul. The boundary between my world and whatever forces cling to that instrument has been irrevocably weakened. Even if I locked the violin away forever, I'd still feel the echoes of that second shadow, that nameless resonance whispering in my ears. I might manage to lock every door and close every window, but I will never truly forget the taste of rosin-laden dread on my lips, the oppressive smell of freshly dug soil, and the phantom shape that played along with me. My nights remain uneasy, my reflection sometimes tinged with a flicker of that silhouette behind me. Despite the fear that grips me, I cling to the fragile hope that acknowledging this presence, whatever it may be, will grant me enough understanding to coexist with it, or at least endure it. Because in the end, there is no running from the music we have already set in motion. Story 9. The first time I heard the larvae sing, I was standing alone in my apartment, all the lights off except for the faint glow coming from the bathroom down the hall. That low, subaquatic chorus, like an ancient chant echoing beneath miles of ocean, caught me off guard. My heart lurched as if it had missed a beat, and a slow, clammy sweat broke over my neck. Right then, in that moment of inescapable quiet, I felt the hush of the world around me intensify, pressing down on my chest with suffocating weight. Whatever was happening, it had taken root in the shadows of my own home, and I could sense it curling around the edges of my daily life, poised to change everything I thought I knew about reality. I live in a modest apartment on the third floor of an older building, the kind with creaky hardwood floors and narrow, dimly lit corridors. There's a single bedroom, a cramped living space, and a tiny kitchen. In that kitchen, on the windowsill, rests my favorite bonsai, a gift from a friend who insisted I needed a touch of green in my life. For months, I cared for that bonsai with a kind of reverence. I trimmed its branches meticulously, watered its roots carefully, and watched it flourish in gentle sunlight each morning. But life has a way of piling up small obligations until they overshadow the things you once considered important. One week, I found myself rushing between deadlines and errands, ignoring the warning signs that the bonsai needed more water. Its soil became bone dry, the leaves drooping in a silent plea. I didn't realize how critical that lapse was until I noticed something bizarre in the kitchen sink. Tiny pale white larvae appeared out of nowhere, spiraling up from the drain in a soft, eerie dance. They reminded me of grains of rice at first glance, but these were undeniably alive. Their bodies were soft and segmented, and as they rose in a slow helix, I heard the faintest resonance, a distant hum that tickled the back of my ears. It was delicate, almost like coral polyps singing from the depths of a submarine chasm. I froze, uncertain if I was hallucinating from fatigue. My mouth went dry, and a surge of cold dread spread from my spine to my fingertips. Instinct guided me to water the bonsai. I had no conscious explanation why. Perhaps in my panicked state, I recalled how crucial it was to keep that tree alive. Or maybe the presence of those larvae triggered some primal response. I poured exactly 3 drops onto the parched soil. In an instant, I heard a moist, slithering sound. My eyes flicked back to the sink, and I watched, astonished, as the larvae receded into the drain. It was like they'd been sucked back by an invisible force. Even the ghostly chorus faded, leaving my kitchen in thick silence once again. Although I wanted to believe I'd imagined it all, I felt an almost magnetic curiosity, so I collected one of the larvae before it disappeared completely. It wriggled in a glass jar, a specimen I was determined to examine. The moment its segmented body touched the glass, the jar chilled under my fingertips. I had to set it down because a thin sheen of frost began to form on the inside. Then I noticed something even stranger. Tiny buds, like minuscule leaves, started to sprout along the larva's rings. Over the next few minutes, those green bits grew until they resembled the branches of a miniature tree. My pulse hammered so hard in my ears that it nearly drowned out my own breathing. I remember stepping away, leaving the jar sealed on the counter. A trembling numbness overtook me. My mind whirled with questions I couldn't answer. Was this creature parasitic? Did it come from outside, or was it a product of my apartment's plumbing? My senses were on high alert, every hair on my body upright as though the air itself crackled with an electric charge. The only rational thing I could do was stand in a corner of my kitchen, heart pounding like a frantic drum, and wait to see if something else happened. That night, I jerked awake around 3 a.m. A fleeting sense of dread pinned me to my bed. My throat felt parched and my back damp with cold sweat. Something wasn't right. I heard a faint, rhythmic pulsation, as if the walls themselves had acquired a heartbeat. My chest felt tight, and every nerve in my body screamed for me not to move. Yet curiosity, or maybe a terrible compulsion, forced me to push off the covers and approach the living room. Under the faint bluish glow of a street lamp leaking in through the window, I saw the bonsai. Its branches, usually neat and compact, were now bristling with pale cocoons. These cocoons hung like swollen fruit, their surfaces translucent and veined, each throbbing in sync with that maddening pulse. As I crept closer, I heard a whisper at the edge of my mind. It was as though multiple voices spoke just beyond the frequency of human hearing. My pulse quickened, and my breathing became shallow. The raw terror in my chest felt almost suffocating. With trembling fingers, I reached out to touch one of the cocoons, and the voices crystallized into words. They warned me, if I translated the half-mumbled Portuguese, I caught something akin to, "Cultivate us, and we feed your calm." My spine tingled as though a cold breeze had rushed through the room. I withdrew my hand, stumbling backward. In that instant, the cocoons quivered, and for a moment, I feared they might hatch or burst open. My mind flooded with horrifying images of more larvae scattering across my floor, but nothing emerged. The throbbing simply continued, a grim reminder that something impossible had taken root in my home. Sleep was out of the question for the rest of the night. I paced the floor, trying to steady my thoughts. Outside, the street remained silent, the occasional distant car providing meager comfort that the world had not entirely dissolved into madness. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from within my own space. The following morning, bright sunlight spilled across my living room, dispelling some of the gloom, but not my unease. With adrenaline still coursing through my veins, I decided to water the bonsai carefully. I didn't know what would happen if I neglected this bizarre new ecosystem forming in my apartment, but the fear of letting it fester without care felt worse somehow. I poured the usual 3 drops of water onto the soil, noticing how the cocoons absorbed the moisture. Their pulsating slowed, transforming into a more gentle ebb and flow, like a slumbering heartbeat. The stench of my own sweat clung to me, and I wiped my brow in an attempt to compose myself. As days passed, life outside my apartment became a hazy backdrop to the real drama unfolding around the bonsai. I tried to keep my routine, showering, working, tidying up, but everything felt uncomfortably surreal. If I delayed watering even by an hour, the cocoons would develop fine cracks. Through those cracks seeped an acrid scent that made my stomach turn. The odor was pungent, almost like rotting citrus, and it had an immediate effect on my surroundings. The wooden bookshelf in the corner sprouted a vivid green moss wherever the smell touched. I would scrub the moss away, only to see it regrow whenever I let the watering schedule slip. My heart would race each time, hands shaking with anxious guilt, as though the very act of failing to nurture these cocoons brought about a twisted punishment. To keep my own sanity, I tried to tell myself there must be a logical explanation. Some mutated fungus or a bizarre parasitic insect had invaded my plumbing. Perhaps the spores had combined with the bonsai soil in some rare, toxic synergy. Part of me wanted to call an exterminator or some kind of specialist, but a stronger, stranger compulsion stopped me. Something about those whispered words, "Cultivate us and we feed your calm," lodged itself in my brain. When I watered the bonsai consistently, a palpable tranquility settled over me. However unnerving the overall situation remained. One evening, the water in my apartment turned a cloudy gray, fizzing slightly as it gushed from the faucet. The hissing reminded me of static on an old television. I felt an irrational jolt of terror. My own sink had become an unpredictable gateway for these larvae. Was the water itself corrupted? My breath caught in my throat, and I could almost hear blood hammering in my temples. Not knowing what else to do, I filled a small container with the murky water and dripped the required 3 drops onto the bonsai. Immediately, the cocoons vibrated, and that familiar underwater chorus filled my ears, muffled yet insistent. That night, I dreamed of walking through a forest, each tree bearing white, writhing larvae in place of leaves. The ground felt spongy beneath my feet, as if covered in moss or compost. Strange calls echoed between the trunks, a sound both alluring and horrifying. When I woke, drenched in sweat, I saw shadows dancing across the walls, though there was no source of light to cause them. My heart pounded with such force that I had to remind myself to breathe slowly, focusing on each inhale and exhale to avoid collapsing into panic. Days turned into a blur. I rarely left my apartment unless I absolutely had to, fearing what might happen in my absence. The lines between dreams and reality grew hazy. I began hearing the larvae singing at random times, while brushing my teeth while pouring coffee. It felt as though they dwelled in every pipe, in every gurgle of the apartment's plumbing. My sense of smell grew more acute. That acrid tang from the cracked cocoons lingered like a constant threat if I so much as delayed the watering by a few minutes. My hands trembled each time I held the watering can, the weight of responsibility crushing my chest. I tried talking indirectly with a coworker, explaining I was going through strange issues at home. He suggested I call maintenance or maybe a plumber, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I worried they would see the pulsating cocoons and the swirling larvae and do something drastic, like disposing of the bonsai or fumigating the apartment. I hated how paralyzed I felt, but there was also a haunting allure to the idea that these creatures, in some twisted way, relied on me. Their presence offered a stillness, an odd calm that was at once soothing and terrifying, as if I'd become part of their world just as they had become part of mine. Every so often, I forced myself to examine the lone larva I'd captured in the jar. The frost never left the glass, and the miniature leaves on its segmented body became more elaborate each day, like an evolving microbonsai. I couldn't understand its function. Was it a scout, a harbinger, or something more sinister? Its presence filled me with awe and dread in equal measure. Late one afternoon, I noticed the cocoons had grown larger, stretching along the branches. Their translucent shells revealed faint outlines of the larvae within. I saw delicate, leaf-like tendrils intertwining with the insect bodies, forming a bizarre fusion of plant and animal life. The sight made my skin prickle. My stomach churned with nausea and wonder. A single droplet of sweat trickled from my temple, and I brushed it away before it fell onto the soil, terrified of initiating some unknown reaction. My head throbbed with the weight of these revelations, and I fought the urge to just fling the bonsai out the window. Yet some deeper instinct told me that if I did, I might unleash something far worse. That evening, an unsettling quiet enveloped the apartment. Even the usual city noise outside felt muffled, as though my windows were sealed by an invisible barrier. I paced the living room, hands clammy, chest tight with anxiety. My ears strained for the slightest sound of that choral-like chant. All I heard was the raspy hush of my own breath. The bonsai seemed dormant, its cocoons still as stone. That lull only made my apprehensions skyrocket. I had grown used to some measure of activity, an occasional quiver or hum. The complete stillness suggested a build-up to something more drastic. Then, around midnight, I heard a faint crack. My body tensed, adrenaline flooding me so suddenly that I felt lightheaded. I rushed to the bonsai, expecting the worst. A single cocoon had begun to split open, a thin fracture glowing faintly with a phosphorescent green hue. My lungs constricted, heart pounding so violently that a pulsing ache spread through my ribs. I grabbed the watering can, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and poured 3 deliberate drops onto the soil. For a moment, time seemed to suspend. Breath lodged in my throat. Then slowly, the crack in the cocoon sealed itself, the glow dimming until the surface looked intact again. In the dead silence that followed, I had a horrifying realization. If I ever truly neglected these creatures, the consequences could be catastrophic. The glimpses of moss devouring my bookshelf, the creeping transformation of my sink water, the infinite voices chanting in the background, all these signs pointed to something bigger than I could fathom. The cocoons were a gateway to an inexplicable phenomenon that fused life forms in unnatural ways. I spent that night half awake, half dreaming, certain I heard soft scratching in the walls, like roots and limbs seeking entry into every corner of my world. By morning, I recognized a change in my own demeanor. I was no longer just a man disturbed by strange occurrences in his home. I was a caretaker of something both horrifying and mesmerizing, locked into a pact I couldn't break without risking an even darker unknown. As the sun rose, I found myself standing at the windowsill, looking down at the silent street below. My breath fogged the glass, and my reflection stared back with hollow eyes, hair damp and disheveled from too many sleepless nights. Behind me, the bonsai's cocoons pulsed quietly, like a dozen hearts beating in unison. The jars and the shelves seemed overshadowed by the presence of these life forms demanding my care. Or was I the one who had become dependent on them? I wanted out, but I also couldn't ignore the twisted comfort they provided. My anxiety felt oddly moderated by their presence, as if part of me had grown addicted to their hum. If I tried to flee, would I ever find peace? Or would the larvae's song haunt me wherever I went? Perhaps a permanent residue had seeped into my mind, entwining itself with my thoughts just as those leaf-like tendrils coiled around the insect bodies. I decided on a final plan. I would care for them one last time, water them precisely, ensure they were stable, then quietly remove the bonsai from my home and leave it at a remote location, maybe a greenhouse or an abandoned lot. Whatever these creatures were, they needed water and the bonsai to maintain their presence. If I removed myself from the equation carefully, maybe I could sever the connection without unleashing something uncontrolled. So that morning, I gave them 3 perfect drops. The cocoons responded with a subtle flicker of luminescence, and I felt a vibrating calm settle over the room. My heart, still pounding with tension, began to steady. I inhaled and exhaled, imagining the swirling larvae retreating into the darkest recesses of my plumbing. I closed my eyes, ignoring how the wooden bookshelf creaked as if in acknowledgement. I have to do it soon, before the next crack appears or the next wave of transformations begins. Yet as I stand here, steeling my resolve, I sense the weight of their presence intensifying, as if they know my plan. The translucent shells shimmer ever so slightly in the morning light, and that subaquatic whisper surges in my ears. My palms grow slick, my heart hammering again with fresh terror. Do I really want to find out what happens if they fight back, or if they somehow follow? Stepping away from the bonsai, I try to muster the courage to see this through. The apartment feels claustrophobic, as though the walls have inched closer during the night. I wipe beads of sweat from my forehead, breathing in jagged gulps. My skin tingles with a sensation akin to static. Part of me wonders if I should just keep watering them, continuing this parasitic relationship. But the rational part of my mind insists that nothing good can come of this ongoing surreal pact. I brace myself, glancing at the now quiet sink. My chest constricts with the thought of opening the drain to see what might be lurking. Yet the notion of leaving these cocoons to flourish unchecked in my cramped apartment is more horrifying than I can bear. I need to act, even if I'm terrified of the consequences. Some primal part of me hopes they're telling the truth, that if I cultivate them, they will feed my calm. But at what cost? My sanity is already eroding. I can't imagine living under the constant shadow of this living, breathing anomaly. Even as I gather the courage to relocate the bonsai, I can't escape the suffocating certainty that I'm bound to these creatures. Whether I succeed or fail, a part of them, of that haunting hum, those twisting leaves, that chilling luminescence, has fused with me forever. Stepping out into the harsh daylight may grant me momentary reprieve, yet I sense I'll feel them thrumming in the back of my mind, reminding me that once you've fed the unknown, it never truly releases you. That's the final thought echoing in my head as I prepare to move the bonsai, an uneasy blend of determination and dread. I pick it up, cocoons shuddering at my touch, and head toward the door. My pulse is frantic, cold perspiration coating my palms and forehead. Each step amplifies the sense of being watched by something both inside and outside my own skin. I'm not certain if I'll find freedom or only a deeper form of entanglement, but I can't stand idle any longer. As I reach for the doorknob, I feel the pulsing intensify beneath my fingertips, like a warning or an entreaty. My breath hitches, and for a split second I consider turning back, abiding by this strange partnership forever. But I force my hand forward and open the door. No matter what lies beyond this threshold, deliverance or some twisted continuation, I know my life will never be the same. And the most harrowing truth of all is that, even if I escape, the echo of that choral chorus will remain lodged in my consciousness. Its haunting melody, a permanent reminder of the day I neglected to water my bonsai and invited something utterly inexplicable into my home. Story 10. I first sensed that something was wrong in my study on a stormy, sunless afternoon. Rain rattled the windows while an unnervingly still air filled the house. A sort of electric thickness weighed on my skin, as though any movement might tear open the atmosphere and release something I couldn't name. It was there, in that claustrophobic hush, that I felt the old wheelchair in the corner pulling at my attention, its worn metal frame faintly reflecting the dim desk lamp. I had inherited it some months ago from a distant relative, but its origin mattered little to me at the time. What mattered was how it chose to appear, always rolled up next to my desk on days when my creative flow had dried up. It was like a silent spectator waiting for me to sit and perform. The sense of unease I felt was immediate, as if the chair itself exuded a presence that seemed to breathe and watch. I remember how it started with small, disquieting details. When I settled into the wheelchair to try and write, the wheels would squeak in a pattern that resembled broken whispers in my left ear. The squeaking soon morphed into actual words that no one else could possibly hear, forming entire sentences that sketched out brilliant storylines in my mind. At first, I embraced those whispered ideas, typing feverishly while that ghostly voice dictated plot after plot. It felt like a dark muse, an eerie but effective source of creativity, fueling my writing beyond my usual capacity. The voice was persuasive, like a trickle of cold inspiration that slid under my scalp and coaxed out my best ideas. I was fascinated and repulsed by it in equal measure. Despite the uneasy edge to this new inspiration, I couldn't deny how productive it made me. My heartbeat would pound at a frantic rhythm whenever I paused, partly out of excitement, but mostly from fear. The few times I let my fingers stop typing, the wheelchair would freeze in place, and I'd feel a horrifying chill around my shoulders. It was as if an invisible grip, colder than winter breath on skin, pressed down on me, warning me to keep writing. Some nights I'd continue long past midnight simply because I dreaded what would happen if I disappointed that unseen presence. My breathing would grow ragged, sweat building on my forehead, and I'd catch myself trembling while the text on my screen blurred under my own frantic gaze. But everything took a darker turn on the latest night of my creative block. Unable to conjure a single word on my own, I lowered myself onto the wheelchair with reluctant desperation. The squeak of its wheels started as usual. Then the tone changed into a timid higher pitch that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. It asked me quite clearly to push it out into the hall. Shocked at this new request, I refused outright, my mouth going dry as soon as I heard that feeble-sounding voice. A sudden tension gathered behind my eyes, as if my own mind struggled to interpret the words, to separate them from hallucination. My heart thundered in my chest, and my pulse echoed in my ears. No sooner had I voiced my refusal than the wheelchair seemed to tilt of its own accord. Without me guiding it, it swiveled with a jarring 180-degree turn, dragging my body along with it. My palms slicked with sweat as I fought to regain control of the wheels, but something stronger than me propelled the chair away from my desk and into the corridor. The overhead light flickered, then died, plunging the hallway into darkness. The only illumination came from the corner lamp in the living room behind me, casting a faint glow that made the shadows in front of me look like living shapes shifting across the walls. As I was pulled further into the corridor, a pungent, smoky odor began to permeate the air. A sudden crunch under the wheels drew my panicked gaze downward. The hardwood floor, once spotless, was now covered with ghostly tire tracks in a fine layer of black soot. My breath turned to shallow gasps when I noticed the pattern. The tracks formed a long spiral leading toward a door I had never noticed before. I knew every inch of this house, or so I had believed. But there it was, a heavy door at the far end of the corridor, sealed with a rusted bolt. My limbs felt numb, blood rushing through my ears, as if my body were on the verge of collapse. I stared at the door in disbelief. The official blueprints for the house included no such entry to a basement or storage room. Yet that door looked old and worn, as though it had been part of the house for decades. The handle was tarnished brass, and the edges of the wooden frame showed signs of age. My mind reeled, each breath feeling like a struggle in the stale corridor air. Despite my growing panic, the wheelchair pressed onward, its wheels rolling steadily toward that locked portal. Any effort to brake only ended in that same frigid grip on my shoulders, as if to scold me for resisting. My entire body was trembling by the time I reached the door. I could feel the thud of my heart pounding in my temples, and a film of cold sweat coated my arms. A strange rasping emanated from behind the door, like the hushed movement of air through a narrow space. That sound, coupled with the oppressive quiet around me, sparked an intense wave of paranoia. My vision swam as I stared at the door. My rational mind insisted this was just an inexplicable phenomenon, perhaps a dream or a product of stress-induced delirium. But the adrenaline surging through my veins convinced me that something more tangible was happening, something that would force me to question everything I believed about this house, about my own imagination. I tried to stand up from the wheelchair, desperate to end its control over me. But as soon as I rose halfway, I lost all feeling in my legs for a few seconds, the numbness spreading like frostbite. My knees buckled, and I collapsed back into the seat. In the darkness, the silence seemed thick, as though it was pressing down on my eardrums. The handle of the door glinted faintly. A monstrous curiosity battled with my fear. I wanted nothing more than to run back to my desk, lock myself away, and pretend none of this existed. Yet the part of me that had always courted the unknown in pursuit of new stories felt drawn to that door, however horrifying. The wheelchair, apparently satisfied that I wouldn't flee again, rolled closer. I reached for the handle, the metallic taste of anxiety coating my tongue. Every second felt like an hour. My mouth was parched, and my hands trembled as I touched the cold brass. I anticipated some unearthly growl or a jolt from behind it, but there was only the same faint rasping, like stale air shifting within. I tested the door and it rattled. Locked. The bolt was rusted in place. Relief and dread collided in my chest. Part of me was grateful I couldn't open it. Another part was sick with curiosity about what lay beyond. My sight blurred slightly, and I realized my entire body was on the brink of collapse. Still, the wheelchair refused to budge from that spot. I whispered, barely audible, that I wanted to go back, that I wanted to return to my desk. And just like that, the corridor light flickered on again, weak and sickly. The wheels slowly turned the chair away from the door, leaving behind the dark spiral of soot like a trail of silent warnings across the floor. Back at my desk, I noticed my hands had begun to shake so violently I could hardly type. But the whisper, that constant push to produce ideas, resumed. It pressed into my ear with renewed urgency, forming tantalizing story snippets that promised literary brilliance if I would only keep writing. My breath was shallow, and I felt tears well up in my eyes, equal parts terror and frustration. I sensed that continuing to write was my only protection against something worse, lurking just outside my office door. The smell of burned dust still hovered in the air, a pungent reminder that a boundary had been crossed. This was no mere superstition or eccentric quirk. I was confronting something truly malevolent, or perhaps something entirely within my own unraveling mind. Over the next days, I tried ignoring the wheelchair altogether. I worked standing, paced the house aimlessly, fought against the horrifying magnetism of that seat and its sinister whispers. I attempted to avoid even looking in its direction, but no matter where I turned, I felt a presence following me, as though invisible hands clung to the back of my shirt, tugging me in subtle increments. When I went to the kitchen, I caught a faint reflection of it in the window, as though the chair had inched into the hallway. My chest tightened whenever I realized that it seemed to move on its own, even when I tried to lock it away in a spare room. Several times, I found the door I'd closed wide open and the wheelchair missing. Then I'd discover it once again at my desk, waiting silently. My paranoia skyrocketed. Each night I triple-checked the locks on the front door, on the windows, on every closet in the house, fully aware that none of these precautionary measures had any bearing on the true threat. The oppressive sense of being watched persisted until I was jolted awake by nightmares at every hour. My dreams were filled with corridors twisted into impossible angles, with wheel marks burned onto the floor, forming messages I couldn't decipher. My sweat-drenched sheets told me that these episodes were more like an unrelenting assault than standard bad dreams. One evening, I noticed a new detail that made my stomach lurch. The spiral of soot tracks in the hallway had grown fainter, as though someone, or something, was gradually wiping them away. I found streak marks across the floor, as if the wheelchair had moved back and forth over the spiral to blur it. I hadn't heard a sound, yet the evidence of activity overnight was undeniable. The realization that it was tampering with evidence of its own existence made my skin prickle with dread. It was as though the house itself conspired to keep me guessing, toying with me, ensuring I wouldn't trust even my own memory. My mistrust in reality deepened. At times, the corridor appeared longer than usual, as if it stretched at an impossible angle. Light bulbs constantly flickered, never quite dying, yet never offering proper illumination. Even the shadows seemed to have a life of their own, bending and curling in my peripheral vision. On one occasion, I had a momentary sensation that the wheelchair seat was slightly warm, as if it had just been occupied by something else. These small accumulations of strangeness pressed on my mind until I felt like a stranger within my own home. In my more rational moments, I considered that this could be a hallucination, a breakdown brought on by anxiety and isolation. I tried to recall if I had always been so jumpy, or if the wheelchair was merely a scapegoat for my creative struggles. But each attempt at rationalization crumbled whenever I heard that faint squeaking voice offering me the ideas I so desperately needed. My heart hammered each time, a twisted mix of relief at the creative spark and horror at the source. The pressure on my shoulders would return, as though it insisted I keep writing no matter the cost. I knew I had reached a breaking point. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked gaunt, eyes bloodshot from countless sleepless nights. My lips were dry and cracked, and I could feel the tension in every muscle, as though I were perpetually bracing for a sudden impact. Yet still, the wheelchair waited, day after day, demanding my engagement. The notion of leaving the house terrified me because I sensed that whatever bound me to the wheelchair might follow. And if it followed me, then I'd have no sanctuary at all. At last, I made a decision I hoped would end the cycle. I would face that mysterious basement door in the corridor. If it was locked, I would find a way to open it. Perhaps confronting whatever lay behind it would stop these manifestations for good. After half a day of searching, I located a set of old keys in a dusty drawer near the fireplace. My hands shook as I tested each one on the door's rusted bolt. The wheelchair was parked nearby, almost humming with quiet anticipation. Adrenaline flooded my veins, my breathing ragged. Finally, the bolt turned. A resounding click echoed in the corridor, and I tugged the door open. The stagnant smell that wafted out made me gag. A darkness loomed beyond, seemingly deeper than the corridor's gloom. I pulled the chain of a single overhead bulb, revealing worn stairs that descended at a steep angle. My heart thudded violently, and a bead of cold sweat slid down my forehead. The wheelchair rolled a tiny bit closer behind me, as if it, too, was peering into that hidden space. My instincts screamed for me to slam the door shut, but curiosity prodded me onward. Step by trembling step, I descended. The light from above barely cut into the darkness, so I relied on a flashlight that flickered uncertainly in my clammy hand. The walls below were lined with dusty shelves, some empty, some holding items I could barely make out through the haze of cobwebs. The air felt denser, and it pressed against me with an almost physical weight. Then I heard it, a faint rattling, akin to a scuttling presence just out of sight. A surge of ice-cold dread coursed through my entire body, but I forced myself to keep going. With every step, the pressure around me intensified, as though the walls themselves contracted. My breathing turned into shallow gasps. My flashlight beam started shaking uncontrollably, illuminating fleeting shapes that might have been boxes or lumps of cloth. Suddenly, I felt the wheelchair at my back. It had come down the steps on its own, silently, as though gliding across the stone. My shoulders tensed under that frigid sensation again. Fear nearly paralyzed me, but I managed to shift my focus from the unknown shapes in the basement to the immediate threat behind me. I stared at the seat, the frayed edges of its upholstery. It seemed almost alive, looming closer in the narrow space. My head spun. A wave of nausea gripped me, but I held firm. I wanted to end this, whatever it was, before it drove me beyond the brink of my sanity. My flashlight flickered again, and for an instant, all light vanished. In that pure blackness, I felt the wheelchair press against my legs. I heard that squeak, the faint echo of the same voice I'd heard before, now oddly pleading, as if wanting me to yield. My heart thundered so violently I thought it would burst. Then, in a moment of desperation and defiance, I lurched forward, nearly tumbling over the last few steps, and found a decrepit door at the far end of the basement. It was half-rotted, as though waiting for someone to discover and break it. With a single trembling kick, it gave way. The smell of fresh, cool air rushed in, and I realized there was an exit leading outside. My chest heaved with relief and panic in equal measure. Turning back, I saw the wheelchair perched at the foot of the stairs. It seemed uncertain, as if its hold on me extended only so far. I seized my chance, rushing out through that hidden exit. My feet sank into damp earth, and I stumbled into the open night. My body shuddered with adrenaline as I finally put distance between myself and that unholy contraption. For a few minutes, I just stood there, gulping in the cold air. I half expected the wheelchair to roll up behind me, to chase me under the moonlight. But it did not follow. It remained at the threshold, wheels casting a strange silhouette in the flickering light from the basement bulb. I retreated around the house, eventually finding my way to the front door, still locked, and re-entered through another set of keys. My entire body ached, as though I had wrestled with something monstrous. But for the first time since the wheelchair appeared, I felt that I had somehow broken part of its power. That night, I locked every door leading to the corridor and slid the largest furniture I could find in front of them. Then I collapsed onto the couch, still trembling, but no longer paralyzed by dread. In the following days, the wheelchair seemed distant. It never reappeared at my desk. The corridor door to the hidden basement refused to open again, despite my repeated attempts. Even the spiral of soot marks faded until only faint smudges remained. My paranoia lingered, a relentless murmur in the back of my thoughts, but the suffocating oppression gradually loosened its grip. At times I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that old frame rolling up behind me, yet I never did. The house, while not entirely comfortable, returned to a sullen quiet. I can't say the experience left me relieved. I still shiver recalling the hush that fell on those corridors, the frigid force on my shoulders whenever I hesitated, and the smoky footprint trail that had guided me toward a hidden place that shouldn't exist. Every time I close my eyes, I see the wheelchair waiting, whispering its seductive ideas. Sometimes I even miss the creative surge it offered, twisted as it was. But I know I can't let it draw me back in. The memory of that endless whisper in the dark basement is enough to make my heartbeat spike with raw panic. I survived that night, but the lingering sense of having brushed against something far beyond my understanding hasn't gone away. My reflection in the mirror looks changed. No visible scars, no outward mark, yet I feel a permanent tension etched into my features. Every so often, I hear a faint squeak in the house. My pulse accelerates and cold sweat forms at my temples no matter what I'm doing. But each time I go to investigate, there's nothing there. No phantom wheelchair, no unknown door. Just the suffocating possibility that it all might reappear if my creative well ever runs dry again. That's the most unsettling truth of all. I'm never sure if it was a haunting force or a haunting piece of my own mind. And every night, before I turn off the lights, I have to shake off the feeling that something lurks just beyond my line of sight, waiting for the right moment to seize control again. The tension may have eased, but the dread remains, lingering in every shadow and every echoing corridor of my home, and maybe also within the uncharted corridors of my mind. Story 11. I knew something was off the moment I first heard the cabinet doors rattling in unison with my heartbeat. It was late on a Sunday, and I was trying out a new sauce recipe, carefully stirring tomatoes and herbs in a heavy-bottomed pot. My kitchen had always been my sanctuary, a place of focus and control. That night, though, the air felt charged, like a static current building in every corner. My chest felt tight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It went beyond the usual paranoia of a creaking house at night. There was an intensity behind it, a low hum like an unspoken presence. I had just finished adding the oregano when I felt a firm pat on my back. It wasn't painful at first. Rather, it felt encouraging, like someone giving me a supportive nudge. Only, I was alone in that house. I spun around, wooden spoon in hand, nearly splattering sauce across the floor. There was no one. My only company was the row of kitchen cabinets, all closed. The lights flickered for a split second, making the shadows on the ceiling appear to dance. My hands were shaking, and my breathing caught in my throat. I inhaled slowly, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the day had been too stressful, or the heat from the stove was playing tricks on my senses. But that was the night the ritual began. I started cooking each Sunday not out of mere habit, but because I felt compelled. If I nailed the recipe, if the sauce consistency was perfect, I would feel that pat on my back again, firm yet strangely comforting. It reminded me of the way a mentor might acknowledge a job well done, except it came from thin air and carried with it a brief wave of warmth, as though someone had pressed a heated palm against my spine. When I found my sauce lacking in flavor or texture, the kitchen rebelled. Cabinet doors slammed, sometimes one after the other, like a wave of dissatisfaction traveling around the room. It was a feedback loop I couldn't fully understand, a disturbing dance of approval or condemnation. The first time it happened, I ran from the kitchen and nearly tumbled down the hallway in my rush to escape. The slamming doors followed me, each dull thud vibrating through the walls. I locked myself in my bedroom, heart pounding so hard I thought it would leap from my chest. My mouth tasted metallic, my skin covered in clammy perspiration. I tried to reassure myself that I was overreacting. Maybe there was some bizarre shift in air pressure or an alignment issue with the hinges. Rational explanations felt safer than the alternative. But deep down, I knew it was something else. Something that watched me, judged me, demanded perfection in the form of a well-seasoned meal. As the weeks went on, I tried ignoring the phenomenon. But each Sunday, when I approached my stove, that energy in the air intensified. The first pat on the back, when I got the sauce right, actually made me smile despite my dread. I craved the sense of triumph, the idea that I had done something exactly as I was meant to. Then inevitably, I'd slip up. Maybe overcook the onions or let the sauce burn a little, and the doors would rattle in a descending rhythm, each slam quieter than the last, as if showing measured disappointment. Sometimes it wasn't just the doors. Utensils would shift in drawers, their rattling clang filling the air with a metallic echo that sent chills through my spine. The tension in my stomach knotted so tightly that I often felt I might throw up from anxiety alone. One night, I committed the gravest sin I'd made so far. I dumped too much salt into the pot. I had measured incorrectly while wiping sweat from my brow, trying to steady the jitters in my hands. The realization hit me the moment I tasted the sauce. It was vile, an unredeemable ocean of salt. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me, dread that snaked up my back and turned my limbs to lead. As if reading my thoughts, the cabinet doors didn't just slam this time. They rotated on their hinges, flipping on 180 degrees with a squeal of twisted metal. I reeled back, eyes wide, heart hammering. Symbols of some sort charred into the wood appeared on the backs of those doors. Twisting shapes, lines intersecting in impossible patterns, all blackened as though scorched by a brand. I could barely breathe. My throat felt thick, my skin tingling with an icy sweat. Desperate to neutralize the mounting terror, I yanked the pot off the stove and rushed to the sink, intending to dump its contents. But the sauce inside hissed and bubbled, too thick, refusing to flow. The stench stung my nostrils, made my eyes water. A harsh clang drew my gaze to the pot, where I found my wooden spoon half submerged, the handle darkened as if burned. And then I saw it, a single fingerprint, large and distinct, pressed into the wooden handle. It wasn't mine. It looked deeper set, the whorls etched into the grain like a brand. I didn't know what else to do, so I threw the entire pot into the trash outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but it offered no solace. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, leaving me jumpy at every rustle of wind or distant car passing on the road. My palms were slick with sweat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I felt like a trespasser in my own home, pinned under the weight of some invisible gaze. When I came back inside, I expected to find the kitchen in chaos. Instead, everything looked eerily normal. The cabinet doors hung straight, their outer surfaces unscathed. But I couldn't bring myself to check if the symbols were still there on the inside. For a few days, I avoided cooking entirely. I lived on takeout, reheating leftovers in the microwave. Each time I passed the stove, I felt a flicker of resentment directed at me, as though the kitchen itself was offended by my refusal to engage with it. The air smelled stale and uninviting, like it was expecting me to do something. By the second week, hunger for a home-cooked meal and an odd compulsion to confront whatever was happening drove me back to the stove. My hands trembled as I reached for a saucepan and placed it on the burner. I turned on the flame, that old sense of dread creeping up my spine. I told myself I would be more precise, more careful, more obedient to whatever force demanded such perfection. That was when I started using a thermometer, measuring everything precisely. Temperature of the sauce, temperature of the meat, temperature of the air if I felt it would help. I kept a strict record of times and methods, treating each meal like a delicate experiment. And whenever I got it right, that pat on my back would come. A heavy, hot palm pressing encouragement into my muscles. I'd exhale shakily, relieved by the absence of anger, but each pat began to leave a mark. In the mornings, facing the mirror, I'd notice fresh bruises forming a handprint across my shoulder blades, the fingers wrapping around me in a disconcertingly familiar shape. I tried to convince myself it was from leaning awkwardly against the counter or straining my back, but the evidence was undeniable. These were finger bruises, distinct and accusatory. I began to wonder if something was sharing my body whenever I cooked, or if there was an external entity physically reaching through the veil of the mundane world to correct me. My dreams at night were filled with vivid images, shadows looming behind the stove, a disembodied hand stirring sauces, and faint whispers telling me to season more carefully. My heart would pound so loud in my ears that I'd jolt awake, drenched in sweat, sure I was about to be ripped from my bed. But day would break, and my small kitchen would greet me with an uneasy calm. One evening, I tried explaining some of this to an old friend over the phone. I spoke in hushed tones, describing the slamming doors, the strange markings. My friend's response was confusion and concern. He suggested that maybe I was overworked, stressed, or having night terrors. He said something like, "You might need a break or a good therapist." I didn't disagree. But even as I nodded at his words, I felt the floor vibrate beneath me. A subtle but clear sign that I should keep my mouth shut about what was happening here. I ended the call quickly, my heart thudding dully. The mental strain wore on me. I became irritable, paranoid. Simple household sounds, a faucet dripping, the ice machine clicking, would set my nerves on edge. Every reflection in a pot or pan made me jump, fearing I'd see something behind me. I started hearing creaks in the walls at odd intervals, a rhythmic shift, like a slow heartbeat. My chest would tighten, breathing uneven, my stomach lurching in anticipation of the next ominous sign. I began second-guessing every memory. Had I always been this anxious? Was I really hearing those noises, or was my mind spiraling? I'd rub my eyes, feeling them burn from sleepless nights, convinced that some part of me was unraveling under the constant pressure. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the sense that I was being guided, molded into a better cook, yet at a severe cost. Every dish I prepared had to be flawless. I spent hours practicing techniques, reading cookbooks, watching tutorials. The cycle of tension and relief became an addiction. I would sweat profusely under the kitchen light, brow beaded with moisture, muscles trembling from the strain of concentration. The aroma of sautéed onions or boiling pasta took on an almost sacramental quality. It was as if my kitchen had become a chapel, and I was both priest and offering, performing a dark liturgy to an unseen deity. One Sunday evening, I decided to push back. I followed a recipe meticulously, but in the final step, I deliberately left out a crucial seasoning. I wanted to see what would happen if I defied the demands. The minute I tasted the sauce, I knew it lacked the savory depth it was supposed to have. My heart hammered so hard I felt faint, but I forced myself to keep stirring, acting as though nothing was wrong. Then came the slamming, cabinet doors banging in quick succession, a furious staccato that seemed to warp the walls. The overhead light flickered, a whining hum filling the air like a chorus of wails. One door after another cracked violently, hinges screeching. The pressure in the room intensified, like the air itself was bearing down on me. I staggered backwards, feeling my vision blur at the edges. My back hit the kitchen island, and something smacked against my shoulder blades. It felt like a brand of heat, so intense that I cried out. Then, silence. My breath rasped in my throat, my pulse thundering in my ears. I could barely stand, knees trembling as though they would give way. The sharp stench of something burnt hung in the air, and my eyes darted around. The cabinet doors were twisted in their frames, some hanging by a single hinge. Symbols glowed faintly in the dim light, each one seeming more elaborate than the last. My pot was rocking on the burner as if someone had pushed it, sauce sloshing inside. I remember thinking, this is it. I've gone too far. I rubbed my back, wincing at the pain. Later, when I checked in the mirror, I saw a raw, red imprint of a hand etched into my skin, the tips of the fingers curling around me like they owned me. It was more than bruising. It felt scalded. I clenched my jaw and felt my stomach knot, pure nausea welling up at the sight. There was no ignoring it anymore. Something had latched onto me, demanding perfection in exchange for peace. I started to question if the house had always harbored this presence, or if I had invited it in with my obsession for culinary mastery. Maybe it was an echo of someone else's skill, someone who had once lived here and refused to relinquish control. I even questioned my own sanity, wondered if I was hallucinating from stress. But no matter how I tried to rationalize, the physical evidence was too glaring to dismiss. Those symbols, the bruises, the warped cabinet doors, all of it was real. By the end of that week, I resolved to escape this cycle. Late that Sunday, I set about cooking one last time. My plan was to create the perfect dish, so flawless that even this presence could not demand more. I wanted to see if it would grant me a reprieve or reveal itself fully. My heart pounded with every spice added, every minute the sauce simmered. The tension was unbearable. I was swallowing repeatedly to keep the dryness from seizing my throat, sweat trickling down my temples. I tasted the sauce, carefully adjusting heat and spices until I felt it was utterly precise. The pat on my back came immediately, a slow, methodical pressure that made me shiver. But I finished the dish nonetheless, setting it onto a plate with trembling hands. I felt the presence hover behind me, a weight in the air that pressed down on my lungs. My shoulders tensed, the hair on my arms standing on end. Then the cabinet doors creaked open, softly this time, as if in approval. My heart hammered in my chest, and my breath came out in shallow bursts. I could see the faint reflection of my own sweat-drenched face in the glossy surface of a nearby cupboard. Shadows danced across the walls in time with the flickering overhead light. I placed the plate on the countertop, not entirely sure what I expected next. An oppressive silence followed. I stayed there, poised on the edge, waiting for something to happen. It felt like an eternity of thick, suffocating stillness. Finally, the overhead light steadied, and a subtle shift of air brushed past me, almost like an exhalation of relief. My chest heaved, and I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. I wasn't sure if I had passed some test or completed a final requirement. The tension in the room receded just enough for me to sense a faint hope. I stepped away from the stove, wiping my forehead with a shaky hand. My eyes drifted to the cabinets, still bearing their scars but no longer contorted at unnatural angles. Without a word, I gathered my car keys and a small overnight bag I had packed in secret. I left the plate untouched on the counter, sauce cooling rapidly in the stagnant air. As I pulled out of the driveway, I felt an odd mix of triumph and dread. My back ached where that final pat had landed, and I knew fresh bruises would bloom by morning. Yet my mind buzzed with the possibility that I had somehow appeased whatever dwelled there. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a silhouette standing in the window, watching me depart. But the curtains remained still, the house looming in darkness. Even now, I'm unsure if I freed myself or simply left something behind that will fester, waiting for me to return. A part of me wonders if I'm only prolonging the inevitable, that the next time I pick up a wooden spoon or heat a pot of sauce, I'll sense the same presence. The bruises on my back still linger, faint outlines of fingers that refuse to vanish completely, as though claiming some part of me. I've told myself I'm never going back. There are other kitchens, other places to live. But I can't forget the taste of that final sauce, how perfect it was. Sometimes, in the small hours of the morning, I wake up with a craving I can't quite satisfy. My heart pounds with the urge to cook again, to feel that pat on my back, even though I know the cost it exacts. And in those moments, I realize the real horror lies not just in the kitchen I fled, but in the hold it still has over me, simmering beneath my skin like a recipe that demands to be served. Story 12. A cold spike of dread courses through my veins whenever I recall the first time I heard those hollow knocks against my trunk. Even now, the memory haunts me more than any nightmare could. It happened on a deserted highway under a sickly crimson sunset, and the reverberations felt like a hammer ramming into raw meat. That was months ago, and it marked the beginning of a sequence of events so bizarre and unnerving that I've come to question my sanity, or at least the reliability of my senses. The car was supposed to be my companion, my reliable vessel, but it has become an arena for an entity I can scarcely understand. Whenever I neglect to schedule its maintenance, something crawls out from the shadows, demanding attention in the most unholy way. Each time, the sense of dread grows stronger. The boundaries between reality and delusion blur further, and I'm left gasping for breath in the darkness of my own fear. It all started with the postponed appointment. Life had gotten busy. I had back-to-back work obligations, and I foolishly believed the car could wait another few weeks for its routine checkup. Then the knocking began late one afternoon, after I had parked in my own driveway. It was the kind of knock you feel in your ribcage, a deep thud that seemed to resonate within every panel of metal. I felt the vibrations through the steering wheel before I even registered the sound. My heart rate spiked, my palms grew clammy, and my vision narrowed as though I were on the verge of fainting. The sensation was accompanied by a faint odor I couldn't place at first. It wasn't burnt rubber, and it wasn't oil. It had a sulfuric edge, sharp enough to sting my nostrils, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise in response. I scrambled out of the driver's seat, half expecting to see a branch or some fallen object on the trunk. But there was nothing. The pavement behind my car was empty. The trunk was intact, no visible dents or scratches. Yet the echo of the pounding noise still reverberated in my head. My heart thudded in my chest, and each breath I took felt labored, as though the very air was heavy with dread. Normally I might have brushed it off, but curiosity, bordering on anxious desperation, drove me to pop the trunk. My pulse hammered in my ears as I lifted the lid. That was the first time I saw it. Ashes, not scattered or haphazard, but arranged in a vague human-shaped silhouette. The silhouette was incomplete, like a chalk outline hastily drawn, but there was an unmistakable grin etched in its features. The second I locked eyes with that ash figure, if you can call it that, I felt a chill spider walk along my spine. My throat went dry, and my stomach twisted in a sudden wave of nausea. Confusion warred with my mounting panic. I recalled that a few weeks prior, I had canceled my scheduled maintenance because of a financial crunch. I hadn't paid it much mind, but now, seeing those ashes shaped into a grinning presence, I had the irrational thought that something was punishing me for that seemingly minor neglect. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, muscles tense, thoughts churning. Then, with an almost frenzied urgency, I slammed the trunk shut and stumbled inside my house, locking the door behind me. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that ash silhouette sneering at me. The next morning, after a sleepless haze, I contacted the auto shop and rescheduled my maintenance. The moment I confirmed the appointment, I went outside to check my trunk again. It was empty, spotless actually, and when I ran my hand along the interior, it felt cold, as though the metal had been left in a freezer overnight. For a time I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Maybe I was exhausted, maybe the stress of everyday life had triggered some bizarre hallucination, and for a while, everything was normal. I told no one. Whenever friends or colleagues asked about the car, I replied with vague reassurances that it ran fine. The truth simmered in the back of my mind like a bad dream I refused to revisit. But soon, I canceled another maintenance appointment, again because of schedules that got out of hand. A week passed, maybe two, and I started to hear the sound again, that wet, meaty thump from the trunk. The first time it happened, I was driving at night. The repetitive pounding made my pulse rocket into overdrive. My breathing turned ragged, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, and I had to pull over on the shoulder to check. Without turning off the engine, I stepped out into the lonely stretch of darkness. The road was empty, illuminated only by my flickering hazard lights. My breath fogged in the cool air, but each exhale felt too quick, too tight in my lungs. Popping the trunk, I nearly retched at the stench that wafted out. An unmistakable sulfuric odor, more potent than before. Once again, ashes. This time they swirled into a distinct shape, a wide grin, elongated limbs, as if mocking me. My head spun with a dizzy sense of unreality. I coughed to clear the sulfur taste clinging to my throat, then slammed the trunk shut. Back in the driver's seat, my legs felt rubbery, and I was drenched in cold sweat. I got home and made the call. I rescheduled the maintenance. The following morning, just like before, the trunk was devoid of any remnants of ash. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Whenever I neglected the car's checkup, something emerged. And whenever I arranged the service, the manifestation vanished. It was like there was a malignant force tethered to my vehicle, its presence awakened by my irresponsibility. After the second time, I vowed never to let another maintenance deadline slide. Yet life has a way of throwing wrenches in our best-laid plans. A particularly grueling work project demanded my every waking hour, and I delayed the car's service date once more, telling myself I'd take care of it soon. That's when things escalated beyond a few knocks and a pile of ashes. It was nearing midnight, and I was driving home from the office. The roads were deserted. Streetlights glowed weakly, creating pools of dim yellow in an otherwise obsidian night. My shoulders were tense from too many hours hunched over a desk, and my mind was swimming in half-coherent thoughts. That's when I felt it, a sudden shift in the balance of the car, as though an unseen passenger had settled in the back seat. I glanced at my rearview mirror, but all I saw was the vacant darkness of the road behind me. Yet the sense of weight remained, pressing into the seat cushion with a faint creak of fabric. My pulse raced. My breathing became quick, shallow. A prickle of goosebumps rippled across my arms. I tried to brush it off as fatigue, but then the sulfuric smell returned, drifting up from the back seat like a poisonous fog. It struck me in the face, burned my nostrils, made my eyes water. My heart pounded so violently it felt like it might burst through my ribs. Fighting the urge to panic, I cast another glance at the mirror. This time, something else changed. My reflection looked off. My eyes were dark, almost black, like two pits where my irises should be. My stomach lurched. I blinked, hoping the vision would pass, but it lingered long enough to make me question whether I was losing my mind. Then the dashboard lit up with a warning I had never seen before. Maintenance or exposure. The words flickered in a sickly green color, as though the car itself was warning me of the consequences to come. A wave of confusion and dread crashed over me. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and I thought my lungs might seize up from the sheer panic coursing through my veins. I veered to the side of the road, tires scraping against the gravel shoulder. As soon as I came to a stop, I felt the passenger side door handle jiggle, the metal squeaking under the strain. My mouth went dry. My instincts screamed at me to drive off, but my body felt paralyzed by a fear so cold it froze every muscle. When I finally mustered the courage to look, my eyes caught sight of a figure standing just outside the window. It had a reddish hue, as though lit from within by embers. There was a disquieting stillness to its posture, a barely contained violence in every line of its silhouette. One hand was pressed against the side of my car, and I saw the metal glow under its touch, warping as though subjected to intense heat. The flesh of its hand, if it could even be called flesh, left an impression in the metal, a shallow yet discernible outline of fingers. My heart hammered. My breath came out in ragged spurts. Every instinct told me to get out of there, but my body felt pinned to the seat by a thick blanket of terror. Then, as if some final surge of survival instinct kicked in, I stepped on the accelerator. The figure disappeared from my peripheral vision, and I sped down the empty road, ignoring every traffic rule. I didn't look back until I was halfway across town. Only then did I pull into a gas station, my hands shaking uncontrollably on the steering wheel. In the fluorescent glare of the gas station lights, I inspected my car. The metallic imprint of that hand was still visible, slightly bubbled outward, and I could almost feel residual heat radiating from it. My heartbeat was relentless, like a drumbeat driving me to the edge of hysteria. Adrenaline made my thoughts race. I recalled the manager at the auto shop once telling me, in indirect conversation, that neglecting regular maintenance can have catastrophic results for a car. Little did I know it might invite something beyond mechanical failure, something more akin to a curse or a haunting. I knew I had to call the shop right away, so I did, my voice trembling as I spoke to the after-hours voicemail system. I left a message, my words clipped and urgent, insisting I needed the earliest possible appointment. After hanging up, I leaned against my car, cold sweat dripping down my temples. The crisp night air felt suffocating, charged with the sense that I was being watched. My eyes flicked to every shadow, every passing car, expecting at any moment to see that fiery silhouette grin at me from the darkness. Sleep was not an option when I got home. I paced the living room, replaying the events again and again in my head. The knocks on the trunk, the ash silhouette, the sulfur stench, the distorted reflection, and that final confrontation with the being. Each memory struck me like a fresh blow of terror. I felt as though my reality was sliding off its axis. Logical explanations seemed ludicrous. Dreams offered no solace, because each time I drifted off, I jerked awake, sweat slick and tangled in my sheets, convinced I could hear that meaty pounding echoing in the walls. Morning arrived with a cold light that did nothing to dispel my gloom. The shop returned my call and set an appointment for later that day. My relief was immediate, but overshadowed by lingering dread. As I approached my car to drive it to the shop, I paused to examine the trunk. I found no ashes this time, but my hand shook slightly as I reached for the latch. Inside, there was only the spare tire and the usual mess of tools. No smell, no bizarre silhouettes. But the memory remained as vivid as blood on snow. Driving to the auto shop, my paranoia ran wild. Every bump in the road felt like a knock. My mouth was bone dry, and I had to remind myself to breathe before I passed out. The radio was off. Silence felt like my only defense against further disturbances. When I finally reached the shop, the staff, unaware of the supernatural torment I'd endured, went about their usual routine. I watched them from behind the service counter, my mind teetering between relief and apprehension. I kept expecting the lights to flicker or the sulfuric stench to invade the waiting area. But nothing happened. Hours passed, and the mechanics wrapped up the maintenance without any mention of unusual findings. They handed me the keys, remarking in indirect conversation that everything was in decent shape now. I forced a smile, nodding with a sense of gratitude that felt hollow. For several days afterward, life seemed to settle. My car ran smoothly, and the horrifying visions faded into the background. I caught myself almost believing it had been an acute stress reaction, but a lingering sense of vulnerability remained. Each time I heard a faint rattle or squeak in the car, I felt my stomach twist in fear. I took to scheduling future appointments meticulously, even marking them on a physical calendar and setting multiple reminders. I was determined never to let maintenance slide again. Yet the feeling that the entity was merely dormant, not gone, continued to gnaw at me. Even in broad daylight, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder for hints of a burning silhouette. My reflection in the rearview mirror seemed normal, but every so often, I'd catch a flicker of doubt, a momentary shift in the color of my eyes, or a distorted shape that vanished the instant I blinked. My nerves were on a hair trigger, and I found myself jumping at the smallest noises. Despite my best efforts, everyday life has a way of unraveling the best intentions. Work deadlines stack up, unexpected bills come in, personal responsibilities accumulate. Already, I see another maintenance date looming on my calendar, overshadowed by new conflicts and commitments. The mere thought of postponing, even by a day, fills me with a crawling dread that settles deep in my gut. My nightmares, once chaotic, have acquired a repetitive pattern. I'm driving at night when the dashboard illuminates with that sickly green script, maintenance or exposure. In the dream, I open the trunk, and I'm greeted by the ash silhouette with that dreadful grin. Then the trunk slams shut on its own. The red figure appears at my side, and my eyes go black in the mirror. I wake up slick with sweat, heart racing, convinced the dream is both a warning and a premonition. My only solace, if you can call it that, is that so far, I've escaped any permanent harm. The entity seems content to torment but not destroy. I don't know if I can truly fight it or if appeasing it by punctually servicing my vehicle is the only way to hold it at bay. Even now, as I recount these events, my pulse thunders in my ears, and an icy tension coils in my muscles. The mere act of remembering feels like inviting that presence back into my life. Sometimes I catch a faint echo of that sulfuric smell, and my heart seizes up like it's trying to fold in on itself. I can't know for certain if my experiences are the product of a fractured mind, or if there is genuinely a sinister force latched onto my car. But one thing is certain. I will never again take the maintenance schedule lightly, because in the stillness of night, when reason and routine lose their grip, the knocks might return. And if they do, I know what I'll find when I open that trunk. A swirl of cold ashes, forming a sneering silhouette that mocks my own reflection. In that moment, I'll realize once more that forgetting a simple car checkup can open a door to a darker domain, a realm where every breath I take is tainted by sulfur, and every shadow holds a glimpse of glowing red skin. And as I stand there, trembling, I'll be reminded that some mistakes come with a cost far beyond anything printed on an invoice. Story 13. The stale, suffocating air of the abandoned station clung to me the moment I stepped inside, as though the walls themselves exhaled decades of dust and disuse. My first instinct was to check the ground for cracks or hidden pitfalls, but all I saw were scattered fragments of old tickets, torn posters curling at the edges, and a labyrinth of rusted rails. The emptiness seemed absolute. No hint of voices, no echoing footsteps, only the low hum of the wind making its way through broken windows. Yet from the instant I entered, I felt an unsettling sense of being watched. It was as if the station still remembered all the travelers who once hurried across its tiled floors, their energy lingering in the gloom. I was there for an urban photography project, determined to capture the haunting beauty of a place long forgotten. The battered sign outside, half buried in overgrown weeds, bore the station's name so faded that I could scarcely read it. Something about the place had always pulled at me, ever since I first heard rumors of strange phenomena reported by a few bold explorers. Tonight, armed with my camera and a powerful flashlight, I intended to delve into the heart of this forsaken spot. My plan was straightforward: scout interesting angles, snap some atmospheric shots, and leave before midnight. The corridors were silent as I moved forward. Paint peeled from the walls in sheets, drifting to the ground like flakes of dead skin. My breathing became shallow, and my heart thudded a little faster than usual with each step. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trespassing on some forbidden territory. The station's architecture, majestic in its heyday, had succumbed to time. The high vaulted ceiling was now a web of cracks, and every corridor resembled a dim tunnel leading me deeper into an unknowable darkness. My flashlight flickered, casting jittery beams of light against the walls. I brushed off the flicker as a sign that I needed fresh batteries, but part of me wondered if the station's atmosphere itself was at fault. Pushing that thought aside, I made my way to the main platform area. Rows of old benches stood like silent witnesses to ghosts of passengers past. I turned, scanning the high ceiling where shattered lamps swayed slightly, their metal chains creaking faintly. The entire place felt weighed down by something intangible, an oppressive sense of anticipation. I paused near a bank of electronic panels originally meant to display schedules and destinations. They were caked in dust and disconnected from any visible source of power. My flashlight revealed shattered screens, chipped edges, and extensive rusting around the control panels. So, when one flickered to life the moment I directed my light at it, my pulse skyrocketed. There was no hum, no sign of mechanical function, just a sudden glow. My mouth went dry as words formed on the screen: arrival time 0080, and the destination Volta. It defied all logic. The station clearly had no electricity running through it, and even if it did, the console was too damaged to operate. Yet there it was, glowing in the dark, beckoning me to pay attention. I felt my stomach twist, and cold sweat began beating on my forehead. My palms grew clammy around the flashlight. I leaned in, keeping a wary eye on the broken panel, as if it might burst into sparks or vanish altogether. But the display held steady, almost mocking me with its impossible presence. Suddenly, I sensed a vibration beneath my feet. The rails, which lay partially buried under layers of rust and debris, began to quake with a low, rhythmic tremor. Crouching down, I touched the nearest rail. The metal was cold, but I could feel a faint pulsation, as though some colossal engine approached. I swept my flashlight across the tracks, searching for any sign of movement. There was nothing but darkness. No headlights, no silhouette of an approaching train, no distant rumble. Yet the vibration persisted, making my heart pound so violently that I momentarily worried it might echo in the stillness. I reminded myself that I had come prepared for unusual images. After all, capturing eerie, unexplained moments was part of my work. Composing myself, I decided to set up a long exposure shot. If there was something out there, some fleeting phenomenon, I wanted it on camera. Setting up the tripod, I attached my camera and meticulously adjusted the settings. Then I aimed down the tracks, allowing the shutter to remain open for several seconds. In the darkness, my flashlight provided minimal illumination, but I counted on the camera's sensitivity to pick up more than my eyes could see. The whir of the shutter mechanism provided a small dose of comfort amid the oppressive silence. When the shot was done, I eagerly checked the image on the camera's screen. My breathing caught in my throat. The photo revealed a faint glow along the tracks. It was unmistakably shaped like a train. Several luminous wagons lined up behind what looked like a ghostly locomotive. Dark silhouettes stood within those glowing carriages, each figure utterly still, as though frozen in time. A chill snaked up my spine so fiercely that I had to exhale slowly to stop my knees from trembling. I looked up at the tracks in real time. There was only darkness. Yet in my camera, that impossible train had manifested. I stared at the image for a long moment, feeling my sense of reality beginning to slip. Something about those silhouettes made my skin crawl. They were featureless, nearly translucent. My heart kept hammering. A nervous sweat slid down the side of my face, and the dryness in my mouth intensified. The next moment, I heard the faint echo of a train whistle in the distance, as though coming from somewhere deep within the station's corridors. It was so soft I might have questioned whether I heard it at all, if not for the sudden gust of air that blew through the station. That gust brought with it a flurry of crumbling newspapers, their yellowed pages dancing across the floor. Some scraped against my legs, sending a prickly sensation up my calves. One particular sheet ended up plastered against my knee. I gently peeled it away, shining my flashlight on the print. The date in bold letters stopped me cold. It was tomorrow's date, not yet in existence as far as I was concerned. Beneath the date was a headline warning about the retomada da linea, or the line's imminent reopening. My vision blurred for a second, and a wave of nausea hit me. This was entirely impossible. How could this newspaper exist if its publication date was still in the future? My mind raced. Rational explanations felt completely inadequate. Could it be a hoax? Some elaborate set piece left behind by pranksters? The hush in the station, the trembling of the tracks, the flickering signs, and now this future newspaper, it all connected in some terrifying way. In my head, I rehearsed a dozen ways to rationalize it, but each explanation dissolved upon scrutiny. I needed to leave, to get outside into the open air where the world made sense. Gathering my gear, I hurried back toward the entrance, heart pounding as if trying to escape my chest. The turnstiles that once allowed passengers to exit the platform stood there, motionless. I tried to push through one, but it didn't budge. Panicked, I set my flashlight on a nearby ledge and used both hands, leaning my weight against the metal bars. They refused to move an inch. My mouth went even drier, and my breath came in short, sharp bursts. Every instinct demanded I find another way out, but a quick scan showed barred windows, padlocked doors, and looming darkness in every direction. I turned around, shining my flashlight on the bronze statue of the ticket seller that had always been there as a historical artifact. The station was old enough to have one of those near the entrance, an attendant holding a tray for tickets, cast in metal, supposedly a tribute to railway workers of a bygone era. My light settled on its face, and I felt my heart skip as I realized the statue's head, previously facing the corridor, was now rotated unnaturally, nearly 180 degrees, staring directly at me. I couldn't fathom how a solid bronze statue could move, but its eyes, carved from some dark stone, glinted like living orbs under my flashlight. My body tensed with primal terror, an urgent wish to be anywhere else overtaking every thought. For a moment I stood paralyzed, my lips parted but no sound escaping. My pulse roared in my ears. Then the station's overhead lights abruptly flickered on, bathing the corridor in a sickly yellow glow. I heard the faint crackle of electricity coursing through ancient wiring, but the sound was warped, like a distant radio signal. Before I could react, the lights went out again, plunging me into darkness. My flashlight also failed, its beam cutting out as though swallowed by the gloom. In that sudden pitch black, I felt pure panic seize my chest. A wave of claustrophobia wrapped around me, and I fought the urge to scream. My breathing echoed unnaturally, each gasp reminding me of how alone I was. I fumbled for my flashlight switch, clicking it off and on. Nothing happened. My body was drenched in sweat, and my fingers trembled so violently that I almost dropped the flashlight. Then, in the distance, I noticed two faint beams of light, like train headlights, advancing silently along the rusted tracks. No engine noise, no metallic clank, just the hush of something unstoppable moving forward. The lights grew brighter, and an inexplicable warmth emanated from that direction. It felt as if the air itself was heating up, adding a stifling pressure to the hallway. My skin prickled, and I forced myself to walk toward a side passage. I'd scouted the station's layout previously, so I knew there was an emergency exit somewhere down that corridor. The idea of letting that silent train reach me made my stomach lurch with dread. I couldn't see well, but I inched along the wall, trailing my fingertips over chipped tile and flaking plaster. All the while, the presence on the track seemed to follow me. Even though I moved parallel to the platform, the warmth intensified, and I sensed that those headlights were tracking my progress. My mind was a swirl of contradictory thoughts. I told myself I might be hallucinating from stress or from inhaling God knows what toxins in that decaying building. Yet everything felt too real. My pounding chest, my clammy skin, the burn in my calf muscles as I moved faster. Eventually, I felt cool metal under my hand. It was the emergency exit door. I pulled on it, but it wouldn't open. My legs trembled at the realization that every possible escape route might be locked or blocked. In my desperation, I yanked the handle repeatedly, the echo of my effort bouncing through the corridor. Then I heard it again, the distant whistle of a train. It was much closer this time, and the same oppressive heat enveloped me. I pictured the ghostly locomotive from my camera display, now materializing on the tracks with those silent silhouettes. Suddenly, the door clicked. Whether it was luck or a trick of the station, I managed to push it open enough to squeeze through, scraping my shoulder on the metal frame. Fresh air blasted my face, and the suffocating dread lifted slightly. But as I stumbled into what should have been an outdoor service alley, I realized I was in another section of the station courtyard. Somehow the door had led me into an enclosed area ringed by towering walls of shattered glass. I saw the night sky above, scattered with stars, but there was no easy path down, only a rusted fire escape clinging precariously to a side wall. A flicker behind me made me turn. Through the open doorway, I could see the platform again, illuminated by my failing flashlight on the ledge, still capturing a faint beam. The statue's head was now turned all the way around, like an impossible owl, pointed in my direction. Its metal eyes glimmered in that dying light. A second later, I heard the thunderous whoosh of something enormous rushing through the station. Yet, bizarrely, it remained silent in terms of mechanical noise, more like a burst of wind and heat than the roar of an actual train. Overcome by panic, I slammed the door shut, pressing my weight against it as if that would keep the impossible out. For several minutes, I stood there trying to calm my racing heart. Gradually, the warmth dissipated, and I found the courage to check my phone. Miraculously, I still had a signal. I immediately searched for the station's name and discovered a local legend. It had been scheduled for demolition decades ago, but then some unexplainable events put it in a suspended state. People reported hearing phantom whistles, seeing trains on the tracks that never appeared in reality, and reading about arrivals that never happened. One detail in particular froze my blood. Every rumor mentioned a sign reading Volta, accompanied by the number 0H00. I locked my phone, my mind spinning. At that point, I had to choose: remain there, cornered by unknown forces, or muster the courage to try one more exit. I decided to climb the fire escape, figuring that if it collapsed, I could at least drop into the courtyard and scramble my way around. Each step up the shaky metal structure set my nerves on edge. My arms quivered from a mix of fatigue and terror. But I made it to a small landing, where a broken window led back inside the main building. With no other option, I ducked through it. The corridor I entered was strangely quiet. The lights overhead buzzed faintly, offering enough glow to see without the flashlight. My eyes darted across the floor, searching for any sign of movement. Instead, I saw something that made my skin crawl. Footprints in the dust, leading away from the window I'd just climbed through. They were not mine. These prints were larger, etched deeply in the grime, and spaced in a manner that suggested a slow, deliberate pace. I followed them with my gaze until they faded near a locked door. No other tracks were visible. A creeping suspicion tugged at my mind that maybe the station itself was reacting to my presence, manifesting illusions or echoes of times long gone. I questioned whether these footprints belonged to a passenger from another era, or perhaps some manifestation of my own dread. My breathing hitched, and I felt a surge of paranoia. Every shadow seemed hostile, every flicker of light a threat. The corridor smelled of mildew and something metallic, like old blood, though I tried not to dwell on that. My vision blurred momentarily, as if my body was rebelling against the intense stress. Somehow, I found another staircase and raced down it, practically leaping 2 steps at a time. My heart pounded so hard, I half expected to faint. But I made it to the ground floor, arriving back at the main hall near the turnstiles. This time, I didn't even touch them. I simply stared, noticing the centuries-old ticket machines and the tarnished coin slots that looked almost newly polished. That made no sense. Everything else in the station was worn and decaying. Then I saw a single gate, slightly ajar, near the edge of the hall. It wasn't open before. Swallowing hard, I approached with caution. A wave of cold air hit me, as if I'd walked into a freezer. Beyond the gate, I glimpsed the outside streetlights, faint but unmistakable. A jolt of relief coursed through me. If I could just reach that street, maybe I could gather my thoughts and call for help. With trembling steps, I slipped through the gate, half expecting it to slam shut or lock. But it stayed open. I crossed the threshold, stumbling onto the cracked sidewalk of the deserted street. When I turned back, the gate was closed. The station beyond was silent and dark, its windows reflecting only my own pale, terrified face in the glow of the streetlight. I stood there panting, sweat-soaked and trembling. My camera bag weighed on my shoulder, a stark reminder that I had documented something unbelievable inside. My arms and legs felt leaden, and a headache pulsed at my temples. The sense of danger began to subside, replaced by an uneasy awareness that what I had seen could not be explained away easily. Even now, hours later, whenever I close my eyes, I recall the luminous train in my photograph and those silent silhouettes behind the windows. My mind replays the moment when the newspaper with tomorrow's date drifted against my knee, as if urging me to heed a warning. Occasionally, I hear phantom whistles echoing in my dreams, and I feel the oppressive heat of those impossibly silent headlights creeping up behind me. Though I escape the station's physical confines, something about that encounter lingers like an invisible tether. I can't help but think that the next time I hear a distant whistle, it may not be my imagination at all, and that somehow the station's timetable has yet to be fulfilled.